The dawn did not so much arrive as bleed. A line of liquid fire seeped over the eastern horizon, catching the highest edges of the canyon walls and painting the ancient sandstone a deep, unsettling red. Far below, in the cool blue shadows of the valley floor, a herd of wild mustangs moved like a single organism, a ripple of muscle and dust. They ran for no reason other than the wind in their manes, a display of freedom so pure it felt like a prayer, and like a prayer, it felt terribly fragile. Miles away, where the shallow river made a silver bend, thin spirals of smoke rose from the chimneys of the Navajo hogans. They signaled life, breakfast, the start of another day. Taza watched it all from the rim of the world, his paint horse standing rock still beneath him. He was a man of perhaps 30 years, though his eyes held the quiet burden of a century. The stillness of the morning was a lie. His gaze tracked lower, scanning the dry earth near the valley entrance. He found what he was looking for, and his jaw tightened. The tracks were stark and arrogant, iron-shod hooves, dozens of them, from the cavalry patrol that was not supposed to be there, and beside them, the broad, churned trail of heavy cattle, Edward Pike's cattle. They were deep inside the boundary line, pressing toward the sacred springs where the people had drawn water since the time of the first man. A muscle bunched in Taza's jaw, the warrior part of him, the man whose wife and son had been lost in a senseless massacre 10 winters past, wanted to ride down there. He wanted to feel the pull of his bow, to send a single flaming arrow into the center of that trespassing herd. He wanted to give Pike a warning written in smoke and fear, but the counsel of the old chief, given just last moon, held him fast. The words were quiet, heavy as stones in his memory. Hold the arrow. Taza, we are few, and they are many. Keep the peace. If peace can still be held. Taza tasted ash in his throat. This peace felt too much like choking. At that same moment, a different kind of life was being shaken apart. Lillian Hart gripped the leather strap inside the stagecoach, her knuckles white. Every rut in the trail felt like a personal assault, jarring her bones until her teeth ached. She was a woman from the East, a world of green lawns, polite parlors, and predictable rain. This land was a canvas of red rock and brutal blue sky, vast and magnificent and utterly indifferent to her comfort. She kept one boot pressed firmly against the carpetbag at her feet. It was heavy, weighted not with clothes, but with books, primers, poetry, Shakespeare, and geographies. In the small reticule looped around her wrist, her fingers nervously traced the outline of a folded paper. It was her letter of appointment, signed by the territorial governor, naming her the new schoolteacher for the settlement of Red Mesa. She was 25 years old, and she had never been so excited or so terrified. In her entire life, she had left a comfortable home, a predictable future, to chase an ideal. She had read the reports coming out of the West, reports of children growing up wild, without letters or numbers, and she believed, with the quiet, unbending faith of her Quaker upbringing, that education was the one true bridge between people. She had come here not just to teach the children of merchants and ranchers, but all of them, the Mexican children, the poor prospectors' sons, and yes, the Navajo children, too, every child. She felt deserved the dignity of the written word. The town she was traveling toward was already stirring under the growing heat. In the cramped, dusty office of the Indian Agency, 2 men stood over a map. Agent Collins was a man who seemed to be perpetually sweating, his soft middle straining the buttons of his government waistcoat. His eyes were small and quick, always calculating. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass, though it was barely 7 in the morning. His guest, Edward Pike, ignored the offer. Pike was a cattle baron, a man built on a scale that matched the land he intended to conquer. He was large, solid, and radiated a cold, patient power. His gaze was fixed on the map, on the green-shaded area that marked the Navajo lands. They are in the way. Collins, Pike said, His voice was a low rumble. "Not accustomed to being argued with. That valley is the only viable pass for my herds to reach the railroad spur. And in 5 years, the railroad itself will want that pass." "I understand that, Edward." "I do," Collins said, his voice slick. "But the treaty is clear. The department in Washington requires justification for relocating a tribe. They are sensitive to appearances." "To hell with appearances," Pike said, though his voice remained level. "They are savages. They squat on land that could be making white men rich. Is that not justification?" "Not for Washington," Collins lamented, taking a sip of the whiskey. "We need proof. We need documented incidents. Proof that the Navajo are a danger, that they are breaking the treaty they signed." Pike turned his head slowly and fixed Collins with a flat, reptilian stare. "Then you had best find some incidents. Agent, or perhaps," he added, the slightest pause, "they just need to be written down correctly. I trust you understand how to file a report that serves the cause of progress." Collins swallowed, the whiskey suddenly tasting sour. He understood perfectly. "I will review the patrol logs," he said, trying to sound efficient. "Sometimes descriptions can be clarified, for the sake of public safety." "Of course." Pike gave a slight nod, a gesture of dismissal, and Collins knew he had his orders. This was the town of Red Mesa, a single, wide street of raw lumber buildings baking in the sun. It was a place where life was reduced to its essentials. The Red Dog Saloon already had its doors propped open, and the tinny, broken sound of an out-of-tune piano drifted into the morning air. Across the street, the new white steeple of the Presbyterian church cast a long, sharp shadow. A few miners, their faces caked with alkali dust, led mules loaded with supplies. Ranch hands gathered outside the general store. But beneath the ordinary bustle, the air was thin and tense. When a Navajo man and his wife walked down the center of the street, their colorful blankets folded to trade for flour and salt. The conversation on the boardwalks died. Men stopped whittling. Women pulled their children just a little closer. No one moved aside. The white townsfolk stared, their face blank and hard, forcing the Navajo couple to walk in the deep dust near the hitching posts. It was a small, daily humiliation. On the sun-bleached wall of the sheriff's office, next to the land deeds, a half-dozen wanted posters flapped in the hot breeze. The faces were sun-faded, the crimes listed in stark black letters, the rewards offered in dollars that seemed impossibly large. The town was peaceful, but it was the peace of a coiled rattlesnake. 20 miles outside of town, the stagecoach pulled into a miserable way station, a squat building of sod and driftwood, to change out the exhausted horses. Lillian stepped down onto the hard-packed earth, her legs trembling with relief. The station master, a gaunt man with a tobacco-stained beard, was talking with 2 freight drivers. "Heard they are sending another teacher to Red Mesa," one of the drivers said, not bothering to lower his voice. "A woman, from back east. Hope she has more sense than the last one," the other replied, spitting a stream of brown juice into the dust. He wanted to teach the Navajo brats, fill their heads with nonsense. He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "They are stubborn as mules and twice as mean. You cannot teach them. You just got to push them out of the way." Lillian felt a rush of cold anger. She straightened her spine, though she barely reached the shoulder of the man speaking. "I am Miss Hart, the new teacher," she announced. The men turned, their expressions ranging from surprise to mild amusement. "And I assure you, gentlemen," she continued, her voice clear and steady, though her heart was pounding, "I did not travel 2,000 miles to teach only half the children. All children are worthy of an education." The man who had spat looked her up and down, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. "You are from the East, ma'am," he said, as if that explained everything. "You will learn." In the Navajo camp, the argument was growing heated. Taza had dismounted and now faced his younger cousin, Kohani. Kohani was barely 20, and his grief for their shrinking world was a fire that burned too hot. Pike's cattle are at the spring, Taza said, his voice low and tight. I saw them, Kohani shot back, his hand instinctively gripping the handle of the knife at his belt. So we do what the old chief says, we wait, we watch them foul our water. I say we send a message. We run those cattle off the canyon edge tonight. We burn his line shacks. He will learn to fear us. No, Taza's voice was flat, final. Kohani stepped closer, his eyes blazing. He spits on our ancestors. And you, cousin, you tell us to do nothing. You tell us to be weak, like old women. I tell you to be smart, Taza countered, his own anger rising, cold and sharp. You attack those cattle, and you give Pike the exact excuse his friend Collins is waiting for. The blue coats will come, not a patrol, Kohani, but a regiment. Do you want to fight the United States Army with our women and children still in this village, with our elders unprotected? We wait. We talk to the chief. We do not start a war we cannot win over a few stupid cows. Kohani stared at him, his chest heaving with frustrated rage. Sometimes, he spat, I do not know whose side you are on. Taza. The words were a blow, landing harder than any fist because they echoed the deepest, darkest doubt in Taza's own soul. He turned his back on his cousin and walked away from the cook fires, the familiar ache of isolation closing around him like a shroud. What Kohani did not know, what only the chief and a few elders knew, was the secret that Taza carried, a brand on his spirit. 2 winters ago, after a brutal cavalry raid had scattered their herds and left the people starving, Taza had done the unthinkable. He had ridden alone to the army fort. He had offered his services as a scout. He knew the canyons, the deserts, the secret ways of the land better than any man alive. He had used that knowledge as a bargaining chip, tracking Apache raiders for the very soldiers who had hunted his own people. His price had been simple and absolute. The soldiers would stay out of the sacred valleys. They would not touch the heart of the dying, the land where the spirits dwelt. The colonel, desperate to stop the raids, had agreed. The arrangement had held for a time. It had saved his village, but it had cost Taza something vital. In his own heart, he was a traitor. To the few in his tribe who suspected, he was a collaborator, a man who had worn the army's brass button and taken their silver. To the army, he was just a tool, an Indian scout to be used and discarded. He was a man walking a razor's edge, belonging to no world, trusted by no one. He needed the high, clean quiet of the cliffs. He mounted his horse, the animal sensing his turmoil and shifting uneasily. He rode back to the canyon rim, the high, lonely place where he felt closest to the sky. The sun was fully risen now, a blinding white disk, and the valley floor was lit in sharp, unforgiving detail. His gaze swept the horizon, past the dirty smudge of Pike's cattle, past the distant, hazy shape of Red Mesa. He was searching, as always, for threats. His eyes locked on a small, insignificant plume of dust far to the east. It was moving steadily along the red dirt track that the white men called a road. It was the stagecoach, a tiny, crawling speck of intrusion, carrying mail, freight, and passengers from the world that would not stop coming. Taza watched it for a long time, his face impassive. He could not know that this speck of dust carried the one person who could shatter the bitter, frozen wall he had built around his heart. He only saw the dust, another sign of the inevitable, another piece of the world that was coming to grind his own to powder. The stagecoach was still a good 10 miles from Red Mesa when the world exploded. They were passing through a narrow stretch of badlands, where the red rock walls pressed in close, making the road a tight, dusty ribbon. Lillian was looking at her hands, wondering how she would ever get the fine grit from under her nails, when the first shot cracked the air. It was not a sound she recognized, but her body knew it. It was a sharp, flat report that meant violence. Outside, the driver cursed. A single, sharp word. A second shot followed, and this time, she heard the unmistakable whine of a bullet ricocheting off the iron brace of the coach. The vehicle lurched, throwing her from her seat onto the floor. Her books, packed so carefully in the carpet bag, spilled across the dusty boards. "Get down!" Ma'am, one of the guards shouted from his perch on top. His voice was tight with panic. Indians. More shots erupted. A chaotic volley. The stagecoach driver screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut short. The coach lost all momentum, slewing sideways into the rocky bank with a crash of splintering wood and protesting leather. Lillian was thrown against the far door, her shoulders striking the frame with a sickening thud. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the high-pitched, terrified whinnying of the horses and the ragged groan of the wounded driver. Then the door was ripped open. A man stood there, silhouetted against the blinding sun. His face was covered by a dark cloth, and in his hand, he held a rifle. He reached in, his grip brutal, and seized her by the arm. He dragged her out of the coach and threw her to the ground. Lillian landed hard, the air driven from her lungs. She gasped, tasting the alkali dust in her mouth. She was paralyzed by a terror so profound it felt like ice in her veins. She could see the driver slumped over the boot, a dark stain spreading across his back. The two guards who had been riding on top were nowhere to be seen, likely fled or worse. Several other riders, all masked, were ransacking the luggage, pulling her trunks from the boot and breaking them open, scattering her modest wardrobe across the desert floor. Then she heard the argument. It was coming from two of the attackers standing near the horses. They were speaking in a language she did not understand, a river of guttural, rapid sounds. But the tone was unmistakable. One man's voice was high and angry, insistent. He kept gesturing toward her with his rifle. The other man's voice was different. It was a low, calm baritone, a voice of command. It spoke fewer words, but each one landed with the weight of a stone, cutting off the other's frantic speech. Lillian, still on her knees, forced herself to look. The angry one, a young man, she thought, was agitated. He wanted to take her. She could feel it. He was pointing at her, then at his horse. He wanted a hostage. The other man stood with his back to her, but his presence was absolute. He was taller than the rest, and he wore a sense of stillness that seemed at odds with the violence he had just committed. He spoke one final word to the younger man, sharp and definitive. The younger man cursed, striking the air with his fist, but he did not move toward her. The taller man turned. For a split second, his face was unmasked, or perhaps his bandana had slipped. He was not looking at her, but at the remaining horses of the stagecoach team, which were tangled in their harnesses. He raised his rifle, not toward her, but toward the sky just above the animals, and fired. The shot was deafening. The lead horse, already panicked, reared and broke the final remnants of its harness, scattering the team. The horses bolted down the road, a wild, panicked flight. It was an act of calculated chaos, a way to strand them, to chase away the only means of escape. Then he turned back to the younger, angry rider. He grabbed him by the front of his shirt, a movement so fast Lillian almost missed it. He was a force of controlled fury. He shoved him backward, pointing definitively away from the coach, back toward the canyons from which they had come. He was ordering a retreat. Lillian, emboldened by a desperation she did not know she possessed, scrambled to her feet. She looked back at the man who had given the order. He had turned his head, his gaze sweeping over her, checking on the wounded driver, assessing the scene. His mask was back in place, but for a fraction of a second, their eyes met. His eyes were not the eyes of a savage. They were dark, immensely deep, and filled with a weary, painful intelligence. She saw a long, faded scar that ran from his left cheekbone down toward his jaw. He did not look at her with malice or with triumph. He looked at her with a kind of, she did not know what it was, resignation, anger. He seemed to be looking right through her, and in that one glance, she felt an impossible, bewildering mix of fear and something else, a flicker of safety. He barked a single word at her. It was not Navajo. It was English. Go. Then he was on his horse, and he and his men were gone, vanishing back into the red rock canyons as if they had been ghosts, phantoms of the heat. They left behind a wrecked coach, a bleeding man, and a silence that rang in Lillian's ears. It took the returning guards, who had hidden in the rocks, nearly an hour to calm one of the pack mules and rig it to a broken shaft of the coach. They lifted the driver, who was miraculously alive, though badly wounded, inside. Lillian, in a state of shock, climbed in beside him, trying to use strips of her own petticoat to stanch the bleeding. The guards, their faces pale with fear and shame, led the mule, and they began the long, limping journey back to Red Mesa, leaving her broken trunks and precious books scattered in the dust. They arrived well after sundown, a grim procession that drew the entire town into the street. The driver was carried immediately to the small office of Dr. Miller. The guards, suddenly brave now that they were surrounded by townsfolk, began to tell their story. "Ambush," one of them said, his voice loud and trembling with self-importance. "A whole war party of Navajo, must have been 20 of them, came on us like demons. They shot poor Jeb off the box before we even cleared leather." The other added, "We fought them off, fought them hard, but they were too many. They were going to kill us all, scalp us for sure." Lillian, standing beside the broken coach, her dress torn and stained with dust and another man's blood, listened to the story grow. They were heroes now. They had saved her, saved the coach. They conveniently left out the part where they had run, and the part where the attackers had argued, and the part where one man had deliberately let them go. It was Taza. A voice boomed from the crowd. Edward Pike stepped forward, his face a mask of righteous concern. "I would bet my ranch on it. That two-faced scout. He knows our patrol schedules." "This is an outrage." Agent Collins appeared at Pike's side, mopping his brow. "This is a clear violation of the treaty, an act of war." The crowd, which had been murmuring in fear, now began to mutter in anger. A woman spat. "Animals!" A man shouted, "We should burn them out!" Pike held up a hand. Now, good people, calm yourselves. We must let the law handle this, but I promise you, as a citizen of Red Mesa, I will not stand by while our women are terrorized and our drivers are shot from their seats. Agent Collins and I will see that the town is protected. We will demand action from the Army." A few days later, after the driver was declared stable and Lillian had recovered from her shock in a small room at the back of the general store, the town held a meeting. It was ostensibly to welcome her, the new schoolteacher, but its real purpose was to address the attack. Pike and Collins sat at the front. Next to the mayor, Lillian was given a seat of honor, a symbol of the town's violated innocence. After the mayor's brief words, Agent Collins stood. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice oozing sympathy, "we are all so terribly sorry for the ordeal you have suffered. These savages have shown their true colors. We want you to know that we are taking every step to ensure your safety and to bring these animals to justice." He gestured for her to speak. Lillian stood, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles ached. "Thank you, Agent Collins, Mr. Pike, everyone." Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the tense silence of the room. It was a terrible thing, but I must be honest about what I saw." A hush fell. "They were masked," she continued, choosing her words with care. "I do not know who they were, but I do not believe they meant to kill us all. They had the chance." Pike leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "They argued," she said in their own language. "I saw one man, the one who seemed to be the leader, stop another from taking me. He stopped him, and then he was the one who shot the harness to make the horses run. He wanted us stranded, perhaps, but not dead, and he let us go." The room was silent. A man in the back coughed. Collins smiled, a condescending, paternal expression. "Miss Hart, you are very brave, And it is a credit to your gentle nature that you would see the good in such a moment. But you are from the East. You do not understand these people. It was a trick, a game they play. They are cruel. They are savages." "She is naive," a woman whispered from the front row, just loud enough for Lillian to hear. "She does not understand," another man said, shaking his head. "They had their fun, that is all." Liliana's face flushed. "I'm telling you what I saw," she insisted. They were not a simple, bloodthirsty mob. It was more complicated than that. Edward Pike stood up, his large frame blocking the light from the window. "Miss Hart, we admire your Christian spirit. Truly we do. But we who have lived in this land, who have buried our friends and fought for our homes, we know the truth. You were lucky, and your testimony, born of shock, only proves how dangerous these men are. They can fool even a woman as educated as you. We will handle this. You just rest and think about your school." Lillian sat down, her heart sinking. She felt a wave of profound humiliation. They had not listened. They had patted her on the head, dismissed her as a hysterical, naive woman, and twisted her words to fit the story they had already decided was true. She looked at Pike, and for the first time, she felt a cold knot of genuine fear. But it was not fear of the men in the canyon. It was fear of this man, right here, who smiled so easily and held the town in the palm of his hand. Miles away, in the center of the Navajo camp, the argument was not quiet. Taza stood before the chief and the council of elders. Kohani stood beside him, his face sullen and bruised. "You acted without counsel," the chief, an old man whose face was a map of dry rivers, said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the camp. "You took it upon yourself to make war. Kohani, you are a boy playing with a man's fire, and you are going to burn us all." "They crowd us," Kohani muttered, looking at the ground. "Pike's cattle foul the spring. We did nothing but make a statement. We did not even harm the woman." "You did not harm the woman." Taza's voice was low, vibrating with a rage he had held in check since the attack. "You did not harm her because I pulled you off your horse. You young fool. You were going to take her. A white woman. Do you have any idea what that would have brought down upon us? Do you know what the army does when a white woman is taken? They do not stop to ask questions. They ride and they kill. They kill the guilty. They kill the innocent. They kill the women, the children, the old. You would have doomed us all for your hot-headed pride. And you," the chief turned his sharp, black eyes on Taza. The sudden shift in focus stunned Taza into silence. "You are the one who walks in their world. You are the one who takes their silver and wears their name. Scout, you were supposed to be our bridge, to give us warning, to make them listen. And what has it brought? Pike still comes. The soldiers still ride. And your own cousin runs wild because he no longer trusts the path of peace. You, Taza, are failing on both sides." Taza recoiled as if struck. The words were a public shaming, and they were true. He was trapped. His service to the army, intended to protect his people, had only made him an outcast. His attempts to hold back the hot bloods like Kohani only made him look weak. He stood there, a warrior bound by chains he himself had forged, responsible for everyone, and trusted by no one. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The chief sighed, a long, weary sound, like wind through dry pines. "Kohani, you will give us your rifle and your horse. You will tend the sheep with the women for 1 moon, to think about what it is you are truly protecting. Taza, you will clean up your own mess. Go to the agency, talk to your friend Collins, see what damage this boy has done, see what price we must now pay." Taza nodded once, his face a mask of stone. He turned and walked away, the eyes of his village burning into his back. That night, in his office, Agent Collins dipped his pen in the inkwell. He was writing his official report to the territorial governor and the army command at Fort Defiance. He paused, thinking. He reread the embellished, terrified statements from the stagecoach guards. He thought of Lillian Hart's testimony, and he smiled. Her complicated story was, in its own way, even better. He began to write. "The unprovoked attack on the Red Mesa stagecoach," he wrote, his pen scratching confidently, "demonstrates a new and alarming level of aggression from the local Navajo, while the passengers were spared. The incident was clearly not a simple robbery, but a calculated act of terror intended to intimidate federal employees and stop the progress of civilization. The new schoolteacher, Miss Lillian Hart, reports that the attackers, led by the notorious warrior Taza, showed signs of strategic planning. This coordinated action, combined with recent reports of cattle theft and property damage, proves the local tribe is a growing and imminent threat to public safety. It is my official recommendation that the treaty be renegotiated immediately, and the tribe relocated to the lands designated at the Sand Creek Reservation, a barren but more secure location before a full-scale war erupts." He blotted the page, pleased with his work. It was a masterful blend of truth and lies. He folded the letter, melted a stick of wax, and pressed his official government seal into it. The fuse had been lit. The school was not a school. It was a cast-off warehouse at the end of the main street, where the town faded into alkali dust and greasewood. Its ribs showed through its weathered plank skin, and the wind, which never seemed to stop, hissed through a dozen cracks. The air inside smelled of old grain dust, forgotten harnesses, and the dry, papery skins of mice. Lillian Hart, however, had brought a kind of magic, with her own money, which was precious little. She had bought 3 buckets of whitewash and covered the darkest of the stains. She had paid 2 bits to a carpenter to build 10 rough benches, though they wobbled on the uneven floor. A large, chipped piece of slate, salvaged from a failed mining venture, was propped against the back wall, serving as a blackboard. On the first day, only 6 children came. On the second, 8. They were all white. They were the children of the blacksmith, the general store owner, and 2 were the sons of Mrs. Gable, a severe woman who had inspected Lillian's small room as if searching for insects. The parents were suspicious. They had heard about the incident on the road. They had heard her speak at the town meeting. This schoolteacher from the East, with her soft voice and strange ideas about equality, was a curiosity, and perhaps a dangerous one. They sent their children mostly because they had nowhere else to put them. After a week of teaching sums and the alphabet to a half-empty room, Lillian knew it was not enough. She was failing her own purpose. She put on her best bonnet, the one she saved for Sundays, and walked to the Indian Agency. Agent Collins was there, as she knew he would be, and, as she had feared, Edward Pike was with him, his large frame filling the small office, a cigar smoking in his hand. "Miss Hart," Collins said, rising with a show of greasy politeness. "A pleasure. What can the government do for its star educator today?" Lillian clasped her hands in front of her. "Gentlemen, I have come to make a formal proposal. My school is open, but it is not full. I wish to extend an official invitation to the Navajo families in the valley to send their children." Pike let out a short, barking laugh, which he disguised as a cough. "An invitation, ma'am. You do not invite them. You tell them." "I do not wish to tell them, Mr. Pike," Lillian said, her voice steady. "I wish to ask them. I want to offer a place where their children can learn English. Yes, but I also want to create a space where they can maintain their own language, where they can tell their stories, and I can write them down. A place of mutual respect." Pike looked at her as if she had just grown a second head. "Mutual respect, Miss Hart. You are living in a dream. You cannot educate them. You can only tame them. And the only way to do that is with a firm hand." "My hand is firm enough, sir," she replied, though her knees were shaking. "But I will not use it to strike. I will use it to guide. All I ask is your official sanction." She had expected Collins to block her. She expected a lecture on safety and the separation of the races. Instead, the agent's small eyes lit up. He suddenly saw an angle. A new tool he had not considered. He smiled, a wide, moist expression. Miss Hart, that is a noble idea. A truly Christian sentiment, taming the savage breast with poetry. Eh? He waved a hand, dismissing Pike's objection. Of course. I will support it. In fact, I will sanction it entirely. An excellent plan. Lillian was stunned by the easy victory. Thank you, Agent. But, he interrupted, holding up one soft finger, an undertaking of this sensitivity cannot be left to chance. If we are to bring these children into the town, there must be order, rules, oversight, to ensure they are learning proper American values, of course, to protect them, and to protect our own children. I will make this my personal project. I will handle the diplomacy myself. Lillian felt a sudden chill. The victory was hollow. Collins's enthusiastic support felt far more dangerous than Pike's open contempt. She had just handed him a new, sharper weapon. 2 days later, Taza was summoned. A runner from the village told him Agent Collins demanded his presence. Taza hated the agency building. He hated the smell of stale whiskey, cigar smoke, and the sour scent of the white man's paper laws. He entered without knocking and stood before the desk. Collins, as usual, was sweating. He motioned to a chair. Taza ignored it, remaining standing. Taza, Collins said, his voice friendly. My friend, I have good news, wonderful news. We are all very concerned about the future of your people, about progress, and we have a new opportunity for you. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was an official document, embossed with a government seal. This is a new directive from the Territorial Office. Based on my recommendation, we are helping your children. We are offering them an education, civilization. Miss Hart, the new teacher, is going to save them. Taza's eyes scanned the formal English text. He was one of the few who could read the language, a skill he had learned at the fort and kept hidden like a weapon. The legal phrases were dense, but the meaning was brutally clear. As a gesture of goodwill and a condition of their continued peaceful occupation of the Red Mesa Valley, all Navajo families were required to enroll their children between the ages of 6 and 14 in the new Red Mesa school. The program would teach them English, arithmetic, and American history. Attendance would be mandatory. Failure to comply, the document stated in its final, chilling sentence, would be considered a breach of the 1868 treaty terms and would render the tribe's claim to their current lands null and void. Taza read the last line twice. His blood, which had been simmering with humiliation, turned to ice. It was not an offer. It was an ultimatum. It was the most perfect, vicious trap he had ever seen. They would use the children to steal the land. If the Navajo families refused, they were breaking the treaty and could be legally driven out. If they agreed, they would be feeding their own children into the white man's machine, a machine designed to grind their culture, their language, and their spirits into dust. He looked up from the paper, his face a mask of stone. This is not education, Taza said, his voice flat. This is assimilation. It is a threat. Collins shrugged, spreading his soft hands. It is the law. Taza, it is progress, and it is very generous. We are giving your people a choice, are we not? Take the document. You are my translator. Go and tell your chief the good news. Taza took the paper. It felt heavy as a burial stone in his hand. He turned and walked out, the agent's self-satisfied smile burning into his back. That night, the council fire burned low. Taza stood before the elders and the families of the village. He read the paper, first in the clipped, cold English, and then he translated it into the flowing language of the dying. The reaction was a wave of quiet, horrified grief. It is a trick a woman named Shadi, whose son was 8 years old, cried out. Her voice was sharp with fear. I have heard of these schools. They will take our children, cut their hair, and put them in uniforms. They will beat the language from their tongues and tell them the holy people are devils. I will not give them my son." An old warrior, his face scarred from forgotten battles, spat into the fire. "It is a white man's poison, hidden in a sweet fruit. They could not beat us with soldiers, so now they try to steal our souls, one child at a time." But then another man, Haska, whose small cornfield was struggling in the dry earth near the valley edge, spoke. His voice was pragmatic, weary. But the paper, "Brother," read the last words again, the words about the land. Taza read the sentence again. "Failure to comply will render their claim null and void." A terrible silence fell. They were trapped. They all saw it. To refuse the school meant losing the valley, the sacred springs, the land that held the bones of their ancestors. It meant another long, terrible walk to a barren reservation. To accept the school meant sacrificing their own children to the enemy, trusting them to the very people who had lied to them, cheated them, and killed them. The debate raged for hours, a circle of impossible choices. Taza stood in the middle, the man who had brought the poison. He was the messenger, and in the eyes of many, he was the traitor. He had walked in the white man's world, and this was the disease he had brought back. Later, in the quiet of his family's hogan, Taza sat staring at the dying embers. His little sister, Atsa, emerged from the shadows. She was 11 years old, small for her age, but her eyes held a restless, bright curiosity that reminded him so painfully of his lost son. She had been listening to the entire debate. "Brother," she whispered, her voice barely a sound. He grunted, not looking at her. She moved closer, touching his arm. It was a brave gesture. He was not a man easily touched. "The white woman's school, the paper house. Is it true they have books?" Taza looked at her. He saw her hunger for the world beyond the canyon, a hunger he both feared and understood. "Yes," he said, his voice rough. "They have books, books with marks on the paper that speak, books with pictures of places that are not here." Atsa's eyes widened. "I want to see them," she said. His heart tightened. He wanted to pull her back, to wrap her in the safety of the blankets, to tell her the world outside was filled with men like Pike and Collins who would crush a spirit like hers. He wanted to protect her, but he also remembered the power of the paper he held. He remembered the colonel at the fort, moving his soldiers not with arrows, but with signatures on a page. The world was changing. Strength of the arm was no longer enough. The new weapon was the white man's word. "If you go," he said, his voice harsh to hide the fear he felt for her, "they will not be kind. You will hear ugly words. You will be alone in a room full of strangers." Atsa lifted her chin, a small, proud gesture that mirrored his own. "I am not afraid," she lied, and he heard the tremor in her voice. He made his decision. It was a gamble, the worst gamble of his life, using his own sister as the stake. "Then I will take you," he said. "I will take you to the door, and I will wait. I will wait until she lets you go. Every day. You will not be alone." The next morning, the air was bright and cold. Atsa wore her finest blanket, woven with stripes of red and blue. She held Taza's hand. Her small fingers gripped tightly in his as they walked from the quiet of the valley into the hostile geometry of Red Mesa. He felt the stairs, every merchant sweeping his boardwalk, every freight driver loading a wagon, stopped to watch the tall, scarred warrior and the small girl. Taza kept his eyes forward, his face impassive, but he felt the invisible blows of their contempt. He felt naked, exposed, and full of a quiet, killing rage. He stopped at the open doorway of the warehouse. Lillian was inside, sweeping the floor. The dust motes danced in the shafts of morning light. When his shadow fell across the threshold, she looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. It was him, the man from the canyon, the man whose eyes she had seen over the bandana, the man who had shot the harness, who had barked the single word, Go! He was not a ghost. He was real. And he was standing right in front of her. He was taller than she remembered, and the scar on his cheek was a pale, angry line. Taza looked at her, and he saw her at the same instant. The woman from the stagecoach, the one with the pale, terrified face and the strange, defiant eyes. This was the woman who had spoken at the town meeting. This was the woman Collins was using as a weapon. She was the one building the paper trap for his people. The silence in the doorway was a heavy, vibrating thing. He nudged Atsa forward, breaking the stare. The girl was hiding behind his leg, terrified by the sudden, fierce tension she felt. "This is Atsa," Taza said. His voice was the same low baritone she remembered from the canyon, a sound like rocks moving underwater. "She comes for the school." Lillian tore her gaze from his and looked down at the small, trembling girl. She saw the bright, intelligent eyes, wide with fear. Her heart, which had been hammering against her ribs, suddenly ached. She knelt, ignoring the man in the doorway, focusing all her warmth on the child. "Welcome, Atsa," she said, her voice soft. "I am so glad you are here." Taza did not leave. He did not go back to the valley. He kept his promise. He moved to the side of the doorway, leaned his shoulder against the rough plank wall, and crossed his arms. His message was clear: I am watching you. Lillian stood and turned to the other children. There were 8 of them today, all white. They stared at Atsa as if she were a wild deer that had wandered into a church. Atsa saw their stares and immediately shrank, moving to the darkest corner of the room, trying to make herself invisible. Lillian took a deep breath. Her classroom was now a battlefield, and Taza was the enemy general, standing guard at her border. She had to break the tension, or she would lose them all. She smiled, a bright, strained expression. She looked at Atsa, then at the other children. In a clear, hopeful voice, she said, "Ya'at-i." The word was a catastrophe. She had practiced it all night from a small lexicon she had found, but her Eastern tongue could not form the sounds. It came out as a strangled, nasal squawk. One of the white boys, Sam Gable, snickered. Atsa's head, which had been bowed, snapped up. Her eyes were wide with shock. Then, a tiny, disbelieving giggle escaped her lips. In another corner, a second Navajo child, a boy who had slipped in unnoticed, let out a full, delighted laugh. Suddenly, the spell was broken. The room was just a room. The white children looked confused, but the Navajo children were smiling. Lillian had not shown power. She had shown weakness. She had made herself foolish. And in doing so, she had given them the power. From the doorway, Taza watched. He had expected arrogance. He had expected her to stand tall, to point, to command. He did not expect her to offer herself up for ridicule just to make a child feel welcome. He felt a strange, unfamiliar loosening in his chest. He did not move, but his gaze on her softened by a fraction. The morning wore on. Lillian moved to the blackboard. "A," she said, drawing the large letter. "A is for apple." Sam Gable, the blacksmith's son, was restless. He had been raised on his father's casual hatred of the Indians. He watched Atsa as she sat on her bench, her hands folded, her eyes following Lillian with rapt attention. He could not stand her silence, her difference. He slid off his bench, walked over to her, and kicked the leg of her bench. "You cannot learn this," he said, his voice loud in the quiet room. "You are just a savage." The word landed like a physical blow. It was the ugliest word in the Red Mesa vocabulary. Atsa flinched, curling in on herself as if to ward off a hit. Her eyes, which had been bright, filled with a deep, bottomless shame. In the doorway, Taza tensed. Every muscle in his body went rigid. He saw his sister's shame, and the old, familiar fire of protective rage flooded him. He took one step inside the room, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife he no longer wore to town. "Mr. Taza." Lillian's voice cut through the air. It was not loud, but it had the sharp, clear quality of breaking glass. He froze. "Please wait outside," she said, not looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the boy. "I will handle this." He stared at her back. He wanted to push her aside, to grab the white child and teach him a lesson in fear. But something in her voice, a core of absolute, unshakable authority, held him. He took one grudging step back, remaining in the shadow of the doorway. Lillian turned her full attention to Sam Gable. "Sam," she said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "Stand up straight." The boy, startled by her tone, scrambled to his feet. "What was the word you used?" she asked. Sam shuffled, his bravado fading. I just said." "Tell me the word." "Sam." "Savage," he muttered, scuffing his boot. "Look at me. Say it louder." "Savage," he shouted, defiance returning. "I see." Lillian walked slowly to her small desk. She did not pick up a switch or a ruler. She picked up a copy of her history book. "I am going to tell you a story. Children," she said to the room, "a long time ago, in a land far across the ocean, my own ancestors lived. They lived in huts made of mud and straw. They painted their bodies blue with mud before they went to fight. They did not have books. They did not have churches." She looked directly at Sam. "A people called the Romans, who built great cities and roads, came to their land, and they called my ancestors savages. They said they were ignorant, that they were animals, that they were less than human." She closed the book with a soft thud. "Then I will tell you about the Navajo, a people who were here before any of us, a people who know how to find water in the desert, who know the name of every plant and star, who weave blankets so beautiful that men in great cities call them art, things that I do not know, things that you do not know. Sam." She walked until she was standing right in front of him. "The word savage is a word used by ignorant people. It is a word used by small, frightened bullies who are afraid of things they do not understand. Are you ignorant? Sam, are you a bully?" The boy's face was a mottled, burning red. He had been defeated, not with force, but with logic. He could not meet her eyes. "No, ma'am," he whispered, his voice thick with tears of humiliation. "Then you will turn to Atsa. You will look her in the face, and you will apologize to her for using an ignorant, bullying word." Sam Gable turned, his whole body shaking. He looked at the small Navajo girl, who was watching him with wide, stunned eyes. "I am sorry," he choked out, for using an ignorant word." From the doorway, Taza watched the entire exchange, the tight, burning knot of rage in his stomach, which had been coiled and ready to strike, slowly unwound. He had seen white justice before. It was a rope. It was a soldier's boot. It was a paper that lied. He had never seen this. He had never seen a white person use their power, their place, not to harm, but to defend. He looked at Lillian Hart, her back straight, her face stern and righteous, and for the first time, he saw not a weapon of the enemy, but a warrior in her own right. The day ended. The children filed out. Atsa ran to Taza, her face alive, and for the first time since their mother had died, she chattered, a stream of excited Navajo mixed with the one English word she had learned, apple. Taza was quiet all the way back to the village, his mind replaying the scene in the schoolroom. Lillian was packing her few books when a shadow fell across her desk. She looked up, her hand flying to her heart. Agent Collins stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, that same oily smile on his face. "Miss Hart," he said, stepping inside. "A wonderful day. A triumph of civilization. I saw the children, all together. This is true progress." "Thank you, Agent Collins," she said, her voice wary. "Yes," he continued, his small eyes scanning the poor warehouse, lingering on the cracks in the walls. "You are doing vital work, molding the future, teaching these young minds the importance of cooperation. He lowered his voice, as if sharing a secret, of respecting the laws and the authority of the United States government. We are all on the same team, after all, helping these poor people move forward. He paused, letting his words sink in. A teacher in your position, a teacher who proves she is a true team player, well, she could go very far. She might find herself in a brand new, solidly built schoolhouse, funded by the territory. All she has to do is cooperate. He smiled again, tipped his hat, and left. Lillian stood alone in the dusty, quiet room. The sun was setting, filling the school with long, cold shadows. The ultimatum was unspoken, but perfectly clear. He was not asking her to teach children. He was ordering her to be his spy. The conflict was no longer just in the town or in the canyon. It was right here, in her school, and she was trapped in the middle of it. A routine, of sorts, began. It was a strange, silent ritual that the entire town of Red Mesa learned to observe. Each morning, just as the sun cleared the eastern cliffs and before the heat became a physical weight, Taza would walk out of the valley. He would hold his sister Atsa's hand. He would walk her through the hostile main street, his face a mask, his eyes seeing everything and acknowledging nothing. He would stop at the threshold of the warehouse school. He never went inside, not one step. He would release his sister's hand, and she would run to Lillian, who always waited by the door for her. Then Taza would move to his self-appointed spot, the sliver of shade provided by the building's overhang. He would lean his shoulder against the wall, cross his arms, and wait. For 6 hours, he would stand there. He did not move. He did not speak. The sun would crawl across the sky, dragging the shade away from him, leaving him exposed to the full, brutal glare of the afternoon. But he remained, a silent, unmoving guardian. The townsfolk called him the teacher's shadow. Some mocked him, some feared him. All of them watched him. Inside, Lillian was aware of him every moment. He was a weight in the air, a presence just outside her vision. She would be explaining multiplication or reading a poem, and she would feel his stillness through the open door, a silent judgment. Or perhaps, she sometimes thought, a silent protection. She was learning. She learned to listen as much as she spoke. She began to see the world through the eyes of the 4 Navajo children who now came every day. She set aside an hour each afternoon for stories. At first, the white children were restless, but soon they were captivated. Atsa, who had Taza's own quiet intensity, stood and told the story of the first woman, and how she had woven the world from her thoughts. Another boy, who had Taza's eyes but Kohani's restless energy, drew the sacred mountains on the slate blackboard with a piece of chalk, naming each one, explaining which god lived in which peak. Lillian watched, and she felt her own education. The one from the east was a thin, dry thing compared to this. She saw Taza watching from the doorway, his eyes fixed on the drawings on the slate, his face unreadable. She also learned to navigate the town's rumors. They were as thick and constant as the dust. He is a dangerous one. That Taza, Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, told her one afternoon while buying flour. He killed 4 men up on the Pinos River. My husband says he is just waiting for a chance to strike. He is two-faced, pretends to be peaceful, but he is all poison inside. And later, at the agency, Agent Collins would pat her hand. I am having that man watched. Miss Hart, do not you worry. He is a known agitator. Pike says he is the one stirring up the young men in the village. It is a good thing you are in my protection. Lillian learned to nod, and to smile, and to say nothing. She balanced the town's words against the town's actions. She had heard the stories of Taza's violence, but what she saw, what was real, was the man who stood in the baking sun for 6 hours without water, who never took his eyes off the building that held his sister. What she saw was the man whose mere presence outside the door had stopped Sam Gable from ever using an ugly word again. The rumors and the reality did not match, and it was a puzzle that she found herself trying to solve in the quiet hours of the night. Then, one afternoon in late October, the sky changed. The day had been still and oppressively hot, the air a thick yellow color. Lillian, her dress sticking to her back, was just dismissing the children. "That is all for today," she said. "Remember to practice your letters. Sam and Atsa, thank you for the story about the Spider Woman." It happened in an instant. A low, moaning sound came from the west, a sound that grew into a roar. The yellow sky turned a sickly, churning brown. A wall of dust, 1,000 feet high, slammed into the town of Red Mesa. The first gust hit the warehouse like a cannonball. The building screamed. The old wooden door was ripped from Lillian's hand and slammed wide open, shattering a window. The air in the room became opaque, a choking, swirling cloud of sand and grit. The children screamed. It was a single, high, piercing sound of pure terror. Atsa, blinded, ran toward the door. Sam Gable dove under a bench. Two of the younger children just stood in the middle of the floor, paralyzed with fear. Lillian, her own eyes stinging, tried to grope her way to the door. Children, get back away from the door. A solid shape burst through the storm, a man moving with impossible speed. It was Taza. He was no longer the still, patient shadow. He was a force of pure, focused energy. He grabbed Atsa with one arm, pulling her back from the splintering door frame, and shoved her toward Lillian. "Get them to the back wall," he yelled, his voice a command that cut through the howl of the wind. He threw his entire body against the heavy door, fighting the wind. It took all his strength to force it closed. The latch was broken. The wind hammered on the wood, threatening to rip it from its hinges. "Help me!" he roared. Lillian, her panic replaced by a sudden, clear purpose, shoved the heavier children toward the back. She seized her own desk, the heavy oak piece she had bought from the mayor. "Sam, help me." Together, she and the oldest boy pushed the desk across the floor. Taza wedged it against the door, bracing it. The room was now in near total darkness. The only light, the faint, sickly brown glow that came through the cracks. The sand was everywhere, a fine, gritty rain. The children were coughing, sobbing in the dark. "Cover your faces," Taza ordered. His voice was calm now, the voice of a man who knew this enemy. "Use your shirts. Ma'am, your shawl. Anything. Get on the floor. Stay low." Lillian felt for the children, her hands finding small, trembling shoulders. She tore a scarf from her own neck and pressed it into Atsa's hands. She guided them down until they were a small, huddled knot against the slate blackboard. The wind shrieked, and the roof above them groaned, a sound of old wood being torn apart. Taza did not huddle. He stood guard, his back to the straining door, his eyes scanning the darkness of the room, listening to the sounds of the building. He was, Lillian realized, a protector. He was not a savage. He was not a rumor. He was the only thing in this storm that felt solid. The storm raged for an hour, or perhaps it was a lifetime. Then, as quickly as it had come, it passed. The wind scream faded to a low whine, and then to silence. The only sound in the room was the muffled sobbing of the children and the grit of sand under their own feet. "It is over," Taza said, his voice quiet in the sudden stillness. He pulled the desk away from the door and opened it. The world was gone. The street, the other buildings, the sky itself, all of it was erased, hidden behind a thick brown fog of settled dust. "Children, go straight home," Lillian said, her voice hoarse. "Keep your faces covered until you are inside. Go." They fled, a small herd of frightened ghosts, disappearing into the brown haze. Atsa was the last. She ran to Taza and buried her face in his leg. He put his hand on her head, a rare gesture of comfort. "Wait for me by the street," he told her in Navajo. "I will be there." She nodded and ran after the others. Now, they were alone. Lillian leaned against the wall. Her legs suddenly weak. The adrenaline was gone, leaving an aching exhaustion. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. You saved us. They were so frightened." Taza just nodded. He was not looking at her. He was looking up. His eyes were narrowed, scanning the rafters in the dim, dusty light. "The roof is damaged," he said. He was right. The wind had torn a sheet of tin from the top, and several of the main support beams were groaning, shifting under a new weight of sand. "We should get out," Lillian said, pushing herself away from the wall. As she spoke, there was a terrible sound, the sharp, splintering crack of old wood giving way. Taza's eyes snapped to a spot directly above her. A heavy crossbeam, dislodged by the wind, was tearing free. It did not fall slowly. It dropped. Lillian looked up, her mind too slow to register the danger. She only saw the dark shape detaching itself from the ceiling. Taza did not shout. He did not have time. He moved. In 2 long, silent strides, he was on her. He did not push her. He wrapped his arms around her, twisting his body to cover hers, using his own back as a shield. The beam struck him with a sickening, solid thud. It hit his left shoulder, driving him to one knee, but he did not fall, and he did not release her. He held her pinned against the wall, his arms locked around her, his face buried in her hair, absorbing the entire impact. Lillian screamed. For a full 10 seconds, the world was just the sound of dust settling, the sharp scent of his skin, and the feeling of his heart hammering against her own. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps. "Are you hurt?" he grunted, his voice strained with pain, his mouth moving against her temple. "No," she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. "No, are you?" He released her, pushing himself upright with a sharp intake of breath. He staggered back 1 step, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. His shirt, a simple cotton tunic, was already darkening at the shoulder. The beam lay on the floor, an accusation in the dust. "It is nothing," he said, his teeth clenched. "That is not nothing," she said, her voice finding its strength. "You are bleeding. Sit down. Sit down right now." To her shock, he obeyed. The strength that had carried him through the storm and the impact was gone. He sank onto the nearest student bench, his face pale and beaded with sweat under the layer of dust. Lillian ran to her small supply cabinet. She had bandages, carbolic, and a bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds. She brought them back, along with her own clean handkerchief and a bowl of water. The light was dim, the air thick. She lit the 1 oil lamp she kept on her desk, and its small, yellow flame pushed back the gloom. "You have to take off your shirt," she said. He looked at her, his eyes dark and guarded, even in his pain. For a moment, she thought he would refuse. Then, slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at the wound, he used his right hand to pull the ruined tunic over his head. Lillian's breath caught. She had lived a life of books, of parlors, of men in stiff collars. She was not prepared for the sight of him. In the flickering lamplight, his upper body seemed carved from the same red rock as the canyons. He was lean, but his shoulders and chest were a landscape of hard, defined muscle, scarred in a dozen places. But the new wound was terrible. The end of the beam had been splintered, and it had laid his shoulder open, a long, deep gash that was bleeding sluggishly. "This is bad, Taza," she said, her voice quiet. "Clean it," he said. It was an order. She took a breath, forcing her hands to be steady. "This will hurt." She dipped the handkerchief into the carbolic and whiskey mixture. He did not flinch when she pressed it to the wound. He only stared straight ahead, his jaw so tight she could see the muscles bunch and release. His only sound was a long, slow hiss of breath through his teeth. Her hands moved gently, carefully, cleaning the grit and splinters from the gash. She was all business, her mind focused on the task, She was a teacher. She was a caregiver. This was just another duty. But the man beneath her hands was not an abstract duty. He was intensely real. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin. She could smell the clean, sharp scent of his body, a scent of desert sage and sweat and something uniquely his. As she worked, her fingers brushed the uninjured skin of his chest, and she felt the jolt of it, the warmth and the life. For Taza, it was torture. He had lived in a world of men, of horses, of stone. His wife had been dead for 10 years. His body had been trained to ignore pain, to ignore cold, to ignore the soft, weak thing called desire. He had buried that part of himself so deep he thought it was dead. And now, this woman's hands were on him. They were not the rough, calloused hands of a warrior or a rancher. They were soft. They were gentle. As she cleaned the wound, her fingers moved with a lightness that was almost unbearable. Every brush of her fingertips on his skin was a separate, tiny fire. He felt it in his stomach, a low, coiling heat he had not felt in a decade. He could feel her breath on his shoulder. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her, soap and lavender and chalk dust. He wanted to seize her hands and stop her. He wanted to push her away. And, God help him, he wanted to pull her closer. He wanted to forget Pike and Collins and the army, and the slow death of his people, and just fall into the softness she represented. The desire rose in him, a sudden, choking wave of pure, physical need. It terrified him. It was a betrayal. It was a weakness. This woman was a white woman, the symbol of the world that was destroying his. To want her was to betray his wife's memory. It was to prove that he was, as Kohani had accused, a man of two worlds, and loyal to none. He went rigid, his whole body tensing as if against another blow. Lillian felt it instantly. The muscles under her hand turned to stone. His breathing, which had been steady, became rough and heavy. "Am I hurting you?" she asked, pulling her hand back. He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes, mere inches from hers, were black and blazing. The guard was gone. She was looking into a furnace. She saw his pain, but beneath it, she saw a raw, shocking hunger that made her own heart stop. She felt a flush of heat rise up her neck and flood her face. Her own heart began to pound, a heavy, frantic beat. She was suddenly, intensely aware of him, not as a patient, but as a man. She was aware of the silence, the dim light, the fact that they were completely, utterly alone. She dropped her eyes from his, her hands trembling. I have to bandage it," she stammered. She fumbled with the roll of white cloth. He said nothing. He just watched her, his breathing still rough, his body still tense. She wrapped the bandage, her fingers clumsy, her skin burning every time she accidentally brushed his. She avoided looking at his face. "There," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She tied off the knot, her hands shaking so badly she could hardly do it. "It is done. You should see the doctor." Taza stood up, his movements stiff. He did not look at the bandage. He reached for his ruined tunic and pulled it over his head, wincing as it settled over his shoulder. He looked at her for one long, unreadable moment. The fire in his eyes was banked, the guard back in place. But they both knew what she had seen. "My thanks, ma'am," he said, his voice formal and strangely cold. He turned and walked out of the schoolhouse, disappearing into the brown twilight, leaving her alone with the smell of whiskey and the thundering of her own blood. The fragile piece of red mesa was shattered that week. While Taza recovered, his shoulder ached, but his mind was in deeper turmoil. He could not forget the feel of her hands. Edward Pike did not waste time. With Taza wounded and the town unsettled by the storm, he made his move. He pushed a herd of 200 cattle deep into the Navajo Valley, far past the springs, into the high meadows where the tribe's small flock of sheep grazed. Then, he sent 2 of his own men to do the real work. A Navajo shepherd, an old man, found the bodies of 20 of his sheep. They had not been killed by coyotes. They had been shot. Pike rode to the agency the next day, his face a mask of fury. "They are thieves," he roared at Collins, loud enough for everyone in the street to hear. "The Navajo have stolen 10 of my best steers. I want the army. I want justice." The news hit the Navajo village like a physical blow. They had been shot at, and now they were being called thieves. Kohani, who had served his moon of penance, was beyond reason. His shame had festered into rage. "He kills our sheep, and he calls us thieves," Kohani shouted, stalking through the village, a rifle in his hand, and Taza sits and does nothing. "The chief tells us to be patient. I am done with patience." Taza, his arm in a sling Lillian had made for him, confronted his cousin. "Do not be a fool. Kohani, this is what he wants. He is baiting you." "Then I will take the bait," Kohani shoved him. "You are weak, cousin. Your heart has been softened by the white woman. While you sit in her schoolhouse, I will be a warrior." He and 4 other young men, all as angry and hopeless as he was, rode out that night. Taza, his body aching, could not stop them. They did not just run off the cattle. They attacked. They rode hard into Pike's herd, firing their rifles. They were wild, desperate, and clumsy. They managed to kill 6 cows. In the ensuing chaos, a young cowboy, a boy of no more than 17, was hit in the arm by a stray bullet. He was not badly hurt, but it was enough. It was the perfect excuse. It was the pretext Pike had been waiting for, and Kohani had delivered it to him. The next morning, Agent Collins was not in his office. He was at the telegraph station, his fingers tapping out a long, urgent message to the Army command. A Navajo uprising confirmed. He typed, "Attacked Pike Ranch, killed livestock, wounded cowboy, town in panic. Taza and his warriors are out of control. Send troops immediately to restore order. Full protection required." As he sent the message, Edward Pike was in the back room of the saloon, meeting with the very men who had shot the sheep. "It is time," Pike said, laying a few gold coins on the table. "Tonight, I want a fire, just a small one, at the edge of their camp. Make it look like a cook fire got out of control. A little accident. We need to remind these people that they are not safe on that land. It is time for them to move on." The blame fell on Taza, as he knew it would. He stood before the chief's fire, his bandaged shoulder a dull, throbbing ache beneath his shirt. The sling Lillian had made was gone. He would not show weakness, even if the movement sent jolts of pain up his neck. "He is your blood, Taza," the chief said, his voice quiet, which was always worse than shouting. "He followed your path, walking between the worlds, but he does not have your patience. You let him see your doubt, and he turned it into violence. You could not hold him." "He is a man, not a child," Taza said, his own voice low. "He makes his own choices." Does he, the chief countered, his black eyes sharp, or does he simply follow the example of the man he admires? You show him a path of peace, but your eyes are full of war. You talk of patience, but you stand like a coiled snake. Kohani is your mirror, Taza, and the image he shows is failure. Taza flinched. The words were a public condemnation. Men and women, his own people, watched him from the shadows of their hogans. He was the scout who had brought the army's ultimatum. He was the brother who had taken the first child to the white woman's school. And now, he was the warrior who could not control his own cousin. He felt the weight of their judgment, and a hot, bitter taste of his own guilt. He had tried to walk a line of peace, and all he had done was give Pike the very weapon he needed. He saw it with a terrible clarity, his path of slow, careful concession was not peace. It was just a slower way to die. A few days later, a formal, embossed invitation was delivered to Lillian. It was not left at her small room at the back of the store. It was handed to her by Edward Pike himself, who had ridden up to the schoolhouse at the end of the day. He had dismounted, a gesture of respect that felt all wrong, and removed his fine, wide-brimmed hat. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced rumble. "I'm hosting a small dinner at my home on Saturday evening. The mayor will be there, and Agent Collins, of course, a few of the town's more prominent citizens. We would be honored if you would join us to properly welcome you to Red Mesa." Lillian was taken aback. Since her testimony at the town meeting, Pike had been civil, but cold. This sudden warmth was disorienting. "Mr. Pike, that is very kind," she stammered, "but I am not sure." "Nonsense," he said, smiling with his mouth but not his eyes. "It is the least we can do. We are the civilized folk out here. Miss Hart, we must stick together. I will send a buggy for you at 7. He did not wait for an answer. He bowed, put on his hat, and rode away. Lillian stood holding the thick, creamy card, and she felt a sense of unease. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. Pike's ranch was not a ranch. It was a fortress. It sat on a rise overlooking the entire valley, a large, 2-story house built of thick pine logs brought down from the high mountains. It was the only house in the territory with glass windows in every room. The buggy Pike had sent was well sprung, and the man who drove it was silent. When Lillian entered the house, she felt as if she had stepped back to the east. There was a thick carpet on the floor. The furniture was dark, heavy mahogany. A piano stood in the corner, its keys gleaming, and on the walls hung oil paintings of dark, European landscapes that had no place in this land of sun and rock. Pike was a perfect host. He introduced her to the mayor, a nervous man who owned the bank, and to the other guests. They drank wine from delicate, long-stemmed glasses. Pike's wife, a pale, silent woman who looked like a ghost in her own home, drifted from room to room, ensuring the glasses were filled. "You see, Miss Hart," Pike said, leaning toward her, a glass of dark red wine in his hand. "We are not the barbarians they paint us to be back east. We are building something here, a true civilization. We have rule of law, we have commerce, and thanks to you, we have education." Lillian smiled politely, but she watched him. She watched the way he held his glass, the way his eyes, flat and cold, assessed everyone in the room. He spoke of law, but she remembered the rumors of his men shooting the Navajo sheep. He spoke of civilization, but she felt a cold, predatory power rolling off him. After dinner, a rich, heavy meal of beef and potatoes. Pike drew her aside to the grand piano. He ran one thick finger over the keys, but did not play. "Your work at the school is admirable," he said, his voice low and confidential. "Truly. Agent Collins tells me you have made remarkable progress. The children are eager to learn. Mr. Pike, all of them." "Ah, yes, all of them," he smiled. "But that is where your tender heart, if you will forgive me for saying so, might be misplaced. You are one woman, Miss Hart. You cannot save the whole world." He leaned closer. She could smell the wine on his breath, a sour, heavy scent. "You are wasting your valuable time on those Navajo children," he said. "They cannot be educated. Not really. It is not in their nature. They learn a few letters, and then they go back to the dirt. It is a waste of government resources, a waste of your talent." Lillian stiffened. "I do not agree, sir. Atsa is one of my brightest pupils." Atsa Pike laughed. "Taza's sister. That is like praising a clever coyote. My dear, it is still a coyote." He became serious, his voice dropping to a persuasive murmur. "I am a practical man. I am on the school board. As you know, I am prepared to authorize funds for a new schoolhouse, a proper one, built of brick, with new desks, a real stove, books from Boston, a place where you can truly teach, a place our children deserve." He paused, letting the vision hang in the air. The warehouse was cold, and the roof still leaked when it rained. "All I ask," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "is that you shift your focus, prioritize the children who can actually benefit, the white children, and, as part of your duties, you could..." Help us. You are in a unique position. You hear things. The children talk. You could keep notes. Notes on their attitudes, their behavior, any aggressive or uncooperative tendencies. It would all be part of your official report to Agent Collins. Of course, for the good of the community, to help us identify the troublemakers, like that young fool Kohani, before they cause more violence. Lillian finally understood. The dinner, the wine, the piano, the promise of a new school, it was all a bribe. He was not asking her to teach. He was asking her to be a spy. He was asking her to use her classroom to betray the very children who were beginning to trust her. It was the same offer Collins had made, but wrapped in a velvet glove. This was the moral test she had feared. She took a small step back from him, her hands clasping in front of her. She needed to be careful. This man was dangerous. "Mr. Pike," she said, her voice polite but perfectly clear, like a chip of ice. "I am a schoolteacher. I am not an agent for the government. My only duty is to the children in my care. And I do not, sir, I cannot make a distinction between them. I will teach any child who walks through my door, and I will treat them all with the same respect. I will not be writing any reports, other than on their progress in arithmetic." Pike's face, which had been so full of false warmth, went blank for a single, terrifying second. The mask slipped. His eyes went dead and flat, and she saw in them a cold, bottomless rage. She had defied him. She had failed his test. Then he smiled. It was a dreadful, slow smile that did not touch his eyes. "Of course, Miss Hart," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "Your integrity is admirable. So very Eastern. Please, have some more wine." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing by the piano, her heart hammering. She was no longer a naive woman he could use. She was an obstacle. The attack came 4 nights later. It was a moonless night, the kind of thick, oppressive dark that swallowed the stars. The Navajo village was asleep. The only sounds were the soft stamp of a horse in the makeshift corral and the cry of a distant night bird. Pike's men were professionals. They did not ride in. They left their horses a mile away and crept in on foot, their boots wrapped in rags. They were not carrying torches. They had a can of coal oil. They were not trying to burn the whole village, just to send a message, as Pike had ordered. They chose a hogan on the far western edge of the camp. It was small and old. They splashed the oil on the dry juniper logs and the brush roof. One of them struck a match. The dry wood and oil did not catch slowly. It exploded. The men were gone before the first scream, scrambling back into the darkness. The fire was a roar, a hungry orange monster that lit the entire canyon. People stumbled from their hogans, their eyes wide with sleep and terror. The hogan that was burning belonged to an old woman, Sani. She was a widow, nearly blind, who lived alone. The fire was so fast, so hot, she never had a chance. By the time the men kicked in the door, she was already dead, lost in the collapsing, burning roof. 2 men who had rushed in to save her were badly burned before the heat drove them back. Taza was there, his face a mask of fury, throwing buckets of water from the spring onto the neighboring structures to keep the sparks from spreading. The fire burned itself out in less than 30 minutes, leaving a smoking black circle on the earth and a sickening sweet smell in the air. They found the old woman's body. It was a small, charred bundle. Agent Collins and the town sheriff rode out at dawn. They stood by the smoking ruins, shaking their heads. "Tragic," Collins said, his face a mask of sympathy. "A terrible accident. These old cook fires. It is a dangerous way to live. This just proves how unsafe this valley is." The Navajo stood in a silent, grieving circle. They knew it was not an accident. After Collins and the sheriff left, Taza began his own search. He did not look at the cook fire, which was, as everyone knew, 20 paces from the hogan. He circled the ruins, his eyes on the ground. It did not take him long. The men had been careful, but not careful enough. He found it near a patch of hard, baked clay, a single, clear boot print, deeper at the toe, the mark of a white man's riding boot, with a distinctive, worn heel. And 10 feet away, half hidden under a scorched sagebrush, he found something else, a small, brass shell casing, still shiny, the kind used in the new model rifles the Army and Pike's men carried. It had not been in a fire, it had been dropped. He picked it up, the small piece of metal cold in his palm. It was proof. He closed his fist around it, the sharp edges cutting into his skin. Atsa had seen it all. She had seen the fire. She had heard the old woman's name whispered. She had seen the men carry the small, blanket-wrapped bundle away. She had not cried. She had just watched, her small face pale and still. The next morning, she refused to go to school. "No," she said, her voice flat. She was hiding in the darkest corner of their hogan, her blanket pulled up to her chin. "Atsa, it is time," Taza said, his voice rough, his shoulder ached, his heart was a cold, hard knot of rage. "I am not going. The teacher is waiting for you." Atsa looked at him, and, for the first time, her eyes were not bright with curiosity. They were old, they were dead. "The white people hate us," she said. "A simple statement of fact. They burn our homes, they kill our grandmothers. The teacher is one of them. I will not go." Taza stared at her. His own sister. He had failed to protect her. He had sent her into that world, and that world had followed her home, bringing fire and death. His first instinct was to agree. He wanted to bar the door, to take his rifle, to ride out and find the man who wore those boots and end him. He wanted to pull Atsa back into the safety of their own world and never let her go. But as he looked at her, he saw the future. He saw the brass shell casing in his hand. He saw Pike's smug, civilized face. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that their world was no longer safe. The blankets and the hogans could not protect them from paper laws and paid assassins. The only weapon that could fight this new enemy was the one Lillian Hart held. The books, the words, the white man's knowledge. He was torn. To send her back to that school now felt like an act of unspeakable cruelty, but to keep her here felt like a death sentence. "You will go," he said, his voice hard, "because if it was soft, it would break. They have burned one house. We will not let them burn your mind. Get your blanket." The news reached Lillian an hour later. Sam Gable ran into the school, out of breath. "Miss Hart, there was a fire in the Indian camp, Mrs. Gable says one of them died." Lillian's blood ran cold. She looked at the door. Atsa was not there. Taza was not there. She did not think. She acted. She ran to her room, grabbing the valise she had kept packed ever since the stagecoach attack. It was not filled with clothes. It was her medical kit, clean bandages, carbolic, burn salve, laudanum for the pain. She ran out into the street, her bag in her hand, and started walking toward the valley. Miss Hart, the blacksmith, yelled at her as she passed. "You cannot go out there. It is not safe. They are on the warpath for sure." "They are hurt," she called back, and she did not break her stride. When she walked into the camp, the silence was absolute. It was not the quiet of a sleeping village. It was the quiet of a graveyard. A group of women, their faces streaked with ash, looked up as she approached. Their eyes were flat and hard with hatred. "Where are the injured?" she asked, her voice trembling but clear. No one spoke. A dog growled, low in its throat. Lillian saw a man sitting on the ground, leaning against a wagon wheel, his hands and arms wrapped in filthy rags. She saw the burns. She walked straight to him. She knelt in the dust, opened her bag, and uncorked the carbolic. The women tensed. One of them took a step toward her. Lillian ignored them. She spoke gently to the man. In the few words of Navajo she had learned, "This will hurt, but it will help. Let me—" She began to unwrap the rags. The man winced, but he did not stop her. As she cleaned the wounds, applying the cool salve, the man's face, which had been tight with agony, relaxed. He let out a long, shuddering sigh. She moved to the next one, a woman whose hands were blistered from throwing hot sand. Lillian worked for an hour, kneeling in the dirt, cleaning, bandaging, and soothing. The hard, hateful stares of the women did not soften, but they watched her. They saw her hands, which were gentle. They saw her face, which was full of a quiet, sorrowful purpose. Taza found her there. He was coming back from his confrontation with Atsa, his heart a cold stone. He saw her, a pale figure in a dark dress, kneeling on the ground, her hands covered in the blood and ash of his people. He strode over to her and grabbed her by the arm, pulling her to her feet. The valise fell, spilling bandages into the dust. "What are you doing here?" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He was shaking with a rage so profound it was all he could do not to hurt her. "Let go of me," she cried, trying to pull her arm free. "I am helping." Helping, he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You call this helping you, your people. You come here with your books and your soft words and your pieces of paper. And this is what follows: fire death." He pointed to the smoking ruins of the Hogan. "That is your work. That is what your world brings." He was shouting, his control shattered. He was not seeing her. He was seeing Collins and Pike and the soldiers and the boot print and the dead old woman. He was seeing 10 years of loss and humiliation. "That is not my world," Lillian shouted back, her own fear and grief exploding into anger. She was not afraid of him. She was furious. "I did not do this. Do you think I wanted this?" "It does not matter what you want," he yelled, his face inches from hers. "You are part of it. You are the smile on the face of the man who holds the knife. You are the justification you teach my sister to read, and your friends burn her home." "And that is why I am here," she cried, tears of rage and sorrow streaming down her dusty face. "Do you not understand? I am here because of that. I am here because I cannot stop the fire. But I can. So help me, God. I can dress the wounds. I cannot stand by and do nothing." They stood in the center of the grieving camp, surrounded by smoke, locked in a glare of raw, undisguised anguish. Everything was stripped away. He was not a warrior. She was not a teacher. They were just two people, trapped in a burning world, on opposite sides of a canyon that could not be crossed. Taza's grip on her arm loosened. He looked at her, really looked at her, the tears cutting clean paths through the soot on her cheeks, the defiance in her eyes, the small, trembling line of her mouth. He saw a woman who was just as trapped as he was. He let go of her arm. He said nothing. He turned his back on her and walked to the smoking ruins of Sani's Hogan. The funeral drums began, a low, steady, heartbreaking rhythm. Taza stood by the black circle, the brass shell casing still clutched in his fist. He felt the throb of the drums inside his own chest. He heard Lillian behind him, her breath catching in a small, choked sob. He felt his world split in two. One half of him was pure, cold fire. It was the warrior. It was the man who wanted to take that shell casing, ride to Pike's fortress, and burn it to the ground. He wanted revenge. He wanted to meet violence with violence, to make the white men feel the same pain, the same loss. And then there was the other half, the half that had been buried for 10 years. It was the part of him that had felt her gentle hands on his skin. It was the part of him that had seen her defend Atsa. And it was the part of him that, right now, wanted nothing more than to turn around, walk back to her, and pull her into his arms. He wanted to bury his face in her hair, to hold on to something soft and clean in this world of ash and death. He wanted to protect her, and he wanted, desperately, for her to protect him. The funeral drum beat, thump, thump, thump. He closed his eyes. He tightened his fist around the shell casing until it bit into his palm. He took the second desire, the soft, weak, treacherous one, and he buried it. He buried it deep, under the rage, and the grief, and the duty. He was a warrior. That was all he was allowed to be. The fire in the Navajo camp had served its purpose. It was a message of terror. But Edward Pike knew terror was not enough. He needed a legal pretext. He needed a crime so profound that the Army, and even the hesitant fools in Washington, would have no choice but to act. The fire was an accident. Kohani's small raid was just unrest. He needed war. The day after the fire, he met his men in the back room of the Red Dog Saloon. These were not his regular ranch hands. These were men he paid in gold, men whose faces were on posters in other territories. "The fire was a good start," Pike said, pouring himself a whiskey. "It has them spooked. Now, we make the town scream. The Wells Fargo stage is due tomorrow. It is carrying the Army payroll for the fort." One of the men whistled. "That is a federal guard. Pike, that ain't just cowboys." "There will be 2 guards," Pike said, his voice flat. "You will be 6. I want the strong box. But more than that, I want a story. I want you to leave one of the drivers alive. I want him terrified. And I want him to ride into Red Mesa screaming one word, Navajo." While his men planned the robbery, Pike and Agent Collins walked the main street, fanning the flames of fear. They spoke to the mayor. They spoke to the blacksmith. "It is Taza," Pike said, his voice full of feigned regret. "He is the agitator. He has them all convinced we are their enemies. That fire I heard, he set it himself. A blood sacrifice to stir up his warriors." "A dangerous man," Collins agreed, mopping his face. "He is two-faced. He pretends to be a friend to the agency, but he is a wolf. He is the one who organized that attack on the teacher's stage. He is the one who ordered Kohani to attack Pike's herd. And now this, he is out of control." The town, already on edge, began to simmer. The news hit Red Mesa the next afternoon, just as Lillian was letting the children out of school. A single horse, lathered in foam, galloped down the main street. The rider was not a soldier. He was a stagecoach driver, his face pale, his shirt ripped and bloody. "The stage!" he screamed, pulling the horse to a sliding halt in front of the saloon. They hit the payroll stage, killed the guards. They killed them both, took the box." The street went silent. Men poured out of the saloon and the general store. "Who?" the blacksmith yelled. "Who was it?" The driver, his eyes wide with genuine terror, pointed a trembling finger toward the canyons. "Indians, a war party. 12 of them, painted for war. They came on us like devils. It was a massacre." The word Navajo was not spoken. It did not need to be. The simmer boiled over. At that exact moment, Taza was walking into the Indian agency. He had confronted Atsa, and the dead look in his sister's eyes had hardened his soul. He was done walking the middle line. He strode past Collins' desk and dropped the brass shell casing onto the agent's ledger. It landed with a sharp, metallic click. "This was in the ashes of Sani's Hogan," Taza said, his voice a low, cold monotone. "This is not our fire. This is not our bullet. This is white man's work." Collins looked at the casing, his face turning a pasty white. He began to sweat. "Now, Taza, I do not know what you are implying. It was a tragic accident." "You will send a message to the fort," Taza commanded, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. "You will tell them your man Pike has broken the treaty. You will tell them he murdered an old woman. You will tell—" The door of the agency burst open. It was not one man, it was 12, cowboys, smelling of whiskey and rage. Pike's hired men were among them, their faces grim, playing their parts perfectly. And behind them, 2 soldiers who had been in the saloon, their rifles in their hands. "There he is," one of Pike's men shouted, pointing at Taza. "The murdering ringleader." Collins, seeing his salvation, leaped to his feet. "Taza, you are under arrest. You stand accused of robbing the federal payroll and murdering 2 guards." Taza spun, his hand grabbing his knife, but his mind was reeling in confusion. "What robbery I have been in the valley. I am here to speak of the fire." "He is lying," a cowboy yelled. his hand on his pistol. "He has been planning this for weeks. He organized it all. He is the one." "Seize him," Collins ordered. Taza did not go down easily. He was a warrior. He threw the first man who grabbed him into Collins's desk, scattering the papers. He drew his knife, the blade a flash of silver in the dim office. But he was one man against 12. His wounded shoulder, the one Lillian had bandaged, screamed in protest as he moved. A cowboy shattered a chair over his back. Another one struck him in the head with a rifle butt. He fell to his knees, the world spinning. They were on him, a tangle of boots and fists. They ripped the knife from his hand. They bound his wrists behind him with a pigging rope, pulling it so tight it bit into his skin. They hauled him to his feet, his face already cut and bleeding. "What do we do with him, Agent?" one of the soldiers asked, looking nervous. "He needs to stand trial," Collins said, straightening his waistcoat. "To hell with a trial," Pike's man shouted. "He murdered those guards. We know what the penalty is. Let us save the town the trouble." A low, terrible roar of agreement came from the crowd. They dragged Taza out of the agency and into the street. Someone had a rope, a new, thick, yellow rope. They threw the loop over his head, the coarse fiber scratching his neck, and they began to drag him down the street. Lillian heard the sound first. It was not a storm. It was a human roar, a single, deep-chested sound of rage. She ran from the schoolhouse, her heart seizing. She saw the crowd. The main street was choked with them. Men with rifles, women shaking their fists, children watching with wide, terrified eyes. And in the middle, she saw him. They were dragging Taza toward the big cottonwood tree at the end of the street. His hands were bound. The noose was already around his neck. He stumbled, his bad shoulder making him list to one side. But he did not fall. His face was a mask of blood and dust, but his eyes were open, staring straight ahead. Lillian felt the world tilt. This was not law. This was a nightmare. This was a mob. She thought of the stories she had read, of witch hunts in Salem, of men torn apart by other men in the grip of madness. She looked at the faces in the crowd, faces she recognized, the blacksmith, the store owner, even Mrs. Gable. They were all there, their features twisted into something ugly, something she had never seen. She knew, with a certainty that stopped her breath, that if she stayed silent, if she hid in her schoolhouse, she was as guilty as they were. Her silence was her consent. "No!" she screamed, and she began to run. She pushed into the crowd, her small frame fighting against the heavy bodies of the men. "Stop! What are you doing? Let him go! This is madness!" Hands shoved her back. "Get out of the way, teacher!" a man snarled. "This is not your business. This is justice." "He is a murderer!" a woman shrieked at her. Lillian fell and scrambled to her feet, her dress tearing. She fought her way through until she burst into the clear space around the tree. They had pushed 2 wagons together under the thickest branch. Edward Pike was standing on the wagon bed, his arms spread wide, his face flushed with triumph. "People of Red Mesa," Pike bellowed, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We have lived in fear for too long. We have been patient. We have honored their treaties. And they have repaid us with fire and theft and murder. Our brave soldiers are dead. Our money is gone. The government is slow. But we are not. We have been pushed. And today, we push back today. We show these savages what American justice looks like." The crowd roared its approval. Agent Collins, his face pale but resolute, climbed onto the wagon. He held a piece of paper, a hastily scribbled warrant. "Taza, of the Navajo people," he read, his voice shaking. "You stand accused of conspiracy to commit robbery, of the murder of 2 federal guards, and of inciting a war against the citizens of this territory. The penalty for these crimes is death by hanging." They hauled Taza up onto the wagon bed. He stumbled, but did not fall. He stood there, surrounded, the rope from his neck thrown over the thick branch above him. He looked out over the sea of faces. He saw their hatred. He saw their fear. He knew this was the end. This was the price for his failure. The price for trying to walk the line between two worlds that would never meet. He had failed his people. He had failed himself. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him beg. He lifted his chin, met Pike's triumphant gaze, and then he closed his eyes, waiting for the wagon to be pulled away.
No,
Lillian's voice was a shriek that cut through the bloodlust of the crowd. She scrambled onto the wagon bed, her hair coming loose from its pins, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She stood between Taza and the men holding the rope.
"You cannot do this!"
she screamed, her voice breaking. Pike looked at her with pure, cold annoyance.
Miss Hart, this is not a classroom. Get off this wagon. This is the law. It does not concern you.
It does concern me, she cried, turning to face the crowd. Her whole body was shaking, but she held her ground. You are lying. You are all being lied to. I know this man. You say he attacks stages. You say he is a murderer. She pointed a trembling finger at Taza. Weeks ago, my stage was attacked by men who wanted to harm me, and this man saved me. He was there. He stopped them. He fought his own people to let me go. He saved my life. A stunned murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the story they knew. I told Agent Collins, she yelled, spinning to point at the agent, who recoiled. I told him what happened. I told him the attackers argued. I told him they did not seem to be a war party. And he ignored me. He did not put it in his report. He did not want to hear the truth. She is hysterical, Pike roared, regaining his voice. The man has bewitched her. Look at her. She is defending him. She is an Indian lover. She is a traitor, one of Pike's men shouted from the crowd. Maybe we should hang them both, another yelled. A rock flew from the back and struck the wagon bed near Lillian's feet. The crowd began to surge, splitting into two factions. Listen to her, Mrs. Gable suddenly shouted from the front. She is the teacher. She is a good woman. She would not lie. She is a liar, Pike's man yelled back. Get her out of the way. Lillian stood her ground, but her eyes were fixed on Taza. The crowd saw her face. They saw the terror, the desperation. It was not just an abstract plea for justice. It was a woman begging for the life of a man she cared for. Her voice was trembling, her face streaked with tears, her hands clenched at her sides. The secret of her heart was laid bare for the entire town to see. Deputy Hayes, the town's only official lawman, had been standing near the edge, his face sick, his hand on his holstered pistol. He was a weak man, a man who followed the path of least resistance, but he was not a murderer, and he would not be part of a mob that hanged a man while a white woman screamed his innocence. It was too much. He drew his pistol and fired it into the air. The shot was so loud it shocked the crowd into a sudden, ringing silence. Hold on, Hayes shouted, his voice cracking but loud. Hold on, damn it! He pushed his way to the wagon, his pistol held high. Pike, you take that rope off his neck, now! Pike stared at him, his face purple with rage. Deputy, this man is a confessed... He is a prisoner, Hayes yelled, finding a sudden, desperate courage. And I am the law. We have new testimony. A material witness. I am taking custody of the prisoner. This will be sorted out. By the book, not by a mob. Pike looked at the crowd. Their nerve was broken. The certainty was gone, replaced by confusion. He looked at Hayes's pistol. He had lost. For now. Cut him down, Pike snarled at his men. One of them cut the rope. They shoved Taza, his hands still bound, off the wagon and into the deputy's custody. He goes to the jail, Hayes said, his voice shaking. Until the circuit judge gets here, he goes to the jail. That night, the jail was the quietest place in Red Mesa. Taza sat on the cot in the single cell, the gash on his head cleaned, his shoulder aching with a pain so deep it felt like it was in his bones. The town was silent, brooding. He heard the scrape of the key in the front door. Deputy Hayes was letting someone in. Lillian appeared out of the shadows, carrying the small oil lamp from her desk. She stopped in front of his cell. They were alone, separated by 3 inches of cold iron. The lamp cast huge, flickering shadows on the stone walls. For a long time, neither spoke. They just looked at each other. He saw the tear in her dress, the streak of dirt on her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes. Taza was the first to speak. His voice was a low, rough rasp. "You should not have done that. They were going to kill you," she whispered, her voice thick. "They will not forget what you did," he said. "You stood between them and their blood. You have painted a target on your own back. You have made yourself his enemy." He paused. "For me, I told the truth," she insisted, her eyes holding his. "That is all. I could not stand by." He looked at her, his gaze intense, tracing the line of her jaw, the soft curve of her mouth in the lamplight. He had seen her fight for a child. Now he had seen her fight for him. He slowly stood and walked to the bars. He did not touch her. He did not have to. The air between them was electric, a heavy, tangible thing. "You are a foolish woman," he said, his voice softer now. "A woman with a strong heart. You do not belong in this land." Lillian took a small step closer, until her own hands were inches from the bars. She could feel the heat of him, even through the cold iron. "I am beginning to think," she whispered, her own voice trembling, "that I am exactly where I am supposed to be." The admission hung in the small, dark room. It was done. He was no longer just the Navajo or the scout. She was no longer just the teacher. They were Taza and Lillian. He looked down at the floor, then back at her, his eyes full of a new, terrible weight. "He will not let this go," Taza said. "Pike, Collins, they were one step away. They will not wait for a judge. They will find another way." Lillian met his gaze, her fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve he had not seen before. "Then we will have to find a way, too." The air in Red Mesa was thick with a new, sour kind of quiet. The mob had dispersed, but the rage had not gone. It had simply gone indoors. Men drank in silence at the Red Dog Saloon, their eyes hard. Women pulled their children inside when Lillian walked by, and the door of the general store was suddenly closed to her when she went to buy provisions. She had stopped the hanging, but she had also challenged the town's version of the truth, and for that, she was an outcast. In the back room of that same saloon, Edward Pike and Agent Collins were not quiet. They were furious. "A trial!" Pike slammed his fist on the table, making the whiskey bottle jump. "Are you insane? That sentimental fool of a teacher has given him a story, a defense. What if the circuit judge is another soft-hearted Easterner? What if he listens to her?" "He will not," Collins said, but his voice was thin, his face sweating. "The man is a murderer. The evidence—" "There is no evidence," Pike roared. "We have one terrified stage driver and a stolen box. We have no body, no proof he was even there. All we have is a dead Indian, a wounded cowboy, and a burned Hogan. And now, thanks to your bungling, we have the whole town split. Half of them think the teacher is a saint, and the other half think she is a whore." Collins swallowed. "The telegraph to the army. They will be sending a detachment. They will investigate." Pike's eyes went very cold. "An investigation. Yes, that is exactly what we cannot allow. A real investigation will lead to questions. Questions about the stage, about the fire, about my men. If Taza talks, if that woman talks. No, this must be finished, and it must be finished tonight." Collins looked confused. "How he is in Hayes's jail?" "The jail is a wooden box with one weak man holding the key," Pike said with contempt. He signaled to one of his hired men, the one who had led the chase. "You are going to fix this. The town is angry. They believe the Navajo are on the warpath. What would be more natural than a rescue?" The man's eyes lit up. "A rescue?" "Exactly," Pike said, a slow, ugly smile spreading on his face.
A band of Taza's hot-headed warriors, maybe that young fool Kohani, ride into town in the middle of the night. They are desperate to free their leader. They attack the jail. There is a gunfight. Hayes is overwhelmed. Pike paused, letting the man fill in the rest.
And in the confusion, the man said, Taza is killed, trying to escape. A tragedy. And perhaps, Pike added, the fire from the gunfight just happens to catch the jailhouse. A terrible accident. All the evidence, and the prisoner, gone. And the teacher? The man asked. What about her? Pike said, his voice flat. If she is in the way, if she tries to stop us. Pike took a long drink of his whiskey. Then she is in the way. It was nearly midnight. Lillian could not sleep. Her small room felt like a cage. She was walking, pacing the length of the boardwalk in the shadow of the general store, when she heard the voices from the saloon. The back window was propped open to let out the thick smoke, and the voices carried clearly on the cold night air. A tragedy, she heard Pike's man say. Taza is killed, trying to escape. The fire just happens to catch the jailhouse. Lillian froze. Her blood turned to ice. She did not wait to hear more. She did not run. She forced herself to walk, her steps silent, melting back into the shadows. She went straight to the small house behind the jail where Deputy Hayes lived. She banged on his door, her fists muffled. Deputy Hayes, wake up! He opened the door a crack, his nightshirt rumpled, his eyes blurry with sleep. When he saw her, his face went pale with fear. Miss Hart, what are you doing? You should not be out. It is not safe. They are coming for him, she whispered, her voice a desperate, hard hiss. She pushed her way inside. I heard them. Pike, his men, they are not going to wait for a trial. They are going to attack the jail tonight. They are going to kill Taza, and they are going to burn the building down to hide it. Hayes sat heavily on his cot, his head in his hands. He was a weak man, and his one act of courage at the hanging tree had drained him of all he had. Oh, God, he moaned. I knew it. I knew he would not let it be. What can I do? It is me against a dozen of them. You cannot fight them, Lillian said, her mind working with a desperate, cold clarity. So you cannot be here when they come. He looked up at her. What? You have to let him go, she said. Let him go. Hayes was horrified. He is a federal prisoner. I will be ruined. They will lynch me. They will kill you anyway, Lillian countered, her voice merciless. Do you think they will leave you as a witness? You stood up to Pike. You are a loose end. You have to let Taza go, and you have to ride. You have to ride to the fort, right now. You have to tell the army what you know. You have to tell them what Pike is doing. He stared at her, the terrible logic of it sinking in. She was right. He was a dead man if he stayed. But how? He whispered. I cannot just unlock the door. They will know I did it. I will do it, Lillian said. You give me the key. I will forge a pass, a visitor's pass, from Agent Collins. I will say I am bringing him food, or a Bible. I will get him out. You will be miles away when it happens. You can say you were out on patrol, or that you were overpowered, but you must ride. Ride north. It is the only way. He looked at her, his face a mask of terror. Then he looked at the wall, at the hook where his gun belt hung. He knew she was right. He fumbled at the drawer by his bed and pulled out a heavy iron key. He pressed it into her hand. His own was cold and clammy. God help us, ma'am, he whispered. God help us all. 10 minutes later, Deputy Hayes was on his fastest horse, riding hard out of the north end of town, away from the fort, but away from Red Mesa. Lillian, her heart pounding so hard it felt like a fist in her chest, was walking across the dark, empty street. The wind was rising, a high, lonely sound that moaned through the gaps in the buildings. It was a good sound. It covered the noise of her footsteps. She reached the jail.
She used Hayes's key to open the front office, then lit a small lamp. Her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries. She walked back to the single cell. Taza was not asleep. He was standing, his back to the bars, staring at the small, high window. He heard her footsteps and turned. When he saw her, his eyes narrowed. "Teacher," he said, "this is not a safe place for you." "They are coming," she whispered, her voice tight. She fumbled with the key in the heavy iron lock. "Pike's men! They are coming to kill you! They are going to burn the jail!" The lock clicked, a loud, sharp sound in the silence. She pulled the heavy door open. "We have to go, now." Taza did not move. He stood in the open doorway of his cell, his arms crossed. The lamplight cast deep shadows on his face. "No," he said. "What?" Her voice was a small, choked sound. "What do you mean? No, they will kill you." "I am a prisoner," he said, his voice hard as stone. "I am not a murderer. I will not run like a guilty man. I will wait for the judge." "There is no judge," she cried, her voice rising in panic. "There is only Pike. You will be dead before morning. Do you think they care about guilty or innocent?" "It is my choice," he said, his face rigid with a pride that was so deep it was a form of suicide. "I will not give them the victory of making me a fugitive." Lillian stared at him, her mind screaming. The sound of the wind was louder now, a rising shriek, and beneath it, she thought she heard something else, a distant, rhythmic sound, horses. She grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands, her desperation making her strong. She pulled him close, her face inches from his. "You fool," she hissed, her voice full of a sudden, cold fury. "This is not about you. This is not about your pride. You think you are the only one who matters. What about Atsa? What about the chief? What about your people when they find your body in the ashes? Who do you think they will blame? They will blame Kohani. They will blame your whole village. Pike will have his war. He will get everything he wants. And you will have handed it to him. All because you were too proud to run." She was right. The logic was as brutal and as clear as her eyes. He had been so focused on his own honor that he had not seen the trap. His death would not be an end. It would be the trigger. "You do not owe them your death," she whispered, her grip on his shirt still tight. "You owe your people your life. Now, come with me." The sound was unmistakable now. A dozen horses moving fast, coming down the main street. Taza's resolve shattered. He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and he made his choice. He did not say a word. He grabbed her hand, pulling her from the jail. He did not run to the front. He kicked open the weak back door, the one Hayes used for his refuse. They spilled out into the dark, narrow alley behind the jail. Just as the sound of men dismounting and the splintering crash of the jail's front door echoed from the street. They ran. They kept to the deepest shadows, moving behind the buildings. The town was a maze of sleeping wood and dark alleys. Taza, his shoulders still aching, pulled her along, his hand locked with hers. Her heart felt like it would burst from her chest. They reached the livery stable at the end of town. The front was barred. Taza did not hesitate. He moved to the side, to the high corral fence. He vaulted over it, a fluid, silent motion. He landed in the deep straw inside and turned, reaching up for her. "Jump!" Lillian climbed the rough rails, her skirt tearing, and threw herself over. He caught her, his arms closing around her, easing her fall. For 1 second, she was pressed against his chest, her face against his neck. He was warm, solid. Then he let her go. The stable was dark, smelling of horses and dry hay. He moved with a purpose, not to his own horse, which was still at the village, but to the fastest-looking animals, a big bay and a rangy roan that Taza knew belonged to one of Pike's men. There was no time for saddles. He found 2 bridles, his hands working with practiced speed in the dark. He slipped them on the horses, quieting them with a low, soft sound in their ears.
He led them to the back gate of the corral. He swung up onto the roan, his movements liquid, and reached down for her. "Come." Lillian put her foot on his, and he hauled her up, seating her in front of him on the broad, bare back of the horse. She grabbed a handful of the horse's mane, her body pressed tight against his. He kneed the horse, and they burst from the gate, the bay following. Behind them, a bright orange light bloomed against the night sky. The jail was on fire. Shouts echoed down the street. "They are gone out the back! They are at the livery!" A gunshot cracked the air. A bullet whined past Lillian's ear. Taza did not ride for the valley. That was the first place they would look. He turned the horse south, toward the high, impassable wall of the mesa, toward the Badlands. He gave the horse its head, and they flew into the darkness, a single, desperate shape against the desert, the wind screaming in their ears, the shouts of Red Mesa fading behind them. They rode for hours. They did not speak. The world was reduced to the pounding of hooves, the burn of the wind, and the solid, warm presence of Taza's body surrounding hers. He guided the horse through a landscape that had no trails, a maze of arroyos and canyons lit only by a sliver of moon. Just before dawn, the sky began to turn a sick, gray color. The wind, which had been their ally, became their enemy. It rose again, not with the clean power of the afternoon storm, but with a high, steady shriek. It was another dust storm, a bigger one, a true desert storm that would last for days. "We cannot stay in the open," Taza yelled in her ear over the roar of the wind. He turned the horses into a narrow crack in a canyon wall, a place she would have missed entirely. It was a dark, twisting passage that opened up into a small, hidden canyon, no wider than a riverbed. At the far end, sheltered by a massive overhang of rock, was a dark opening, a cave. He slid off the horse and reached for her. Her legs were numb, and she nearly collapsed when her feet hit the ground. He half carried her into the cave, out of the screaming wind. He tethered the horses deep in the shelter, where they stood with their heads down, trembling with exhaustion. The cave was deep and dry. It was not a home, but it was safety. The sound of the storm was a muffled roar outside. Lillian sank to the sandy floor, her entire body shaking. The terror, the chase, the cold, it all hit her at once. She began to chattering violently, her teeth clicking together. Taza said nothing. He unfastened his heavy blanket roll from the horse he had stolen. Then he went back to the mouth of the cave, his knife in his hand. He found a large, dead greasewood bush that had been sheltered by the rocks. He hacked it apart and brought the wood back, building a small, smokeless fire deep in the cave, where the light would not be seen from the air. The small, crackling flames brought a weak, flickering light to the darkness. Lillian huddled near it, but she could not get warm. The cold was in her bones. Taza watched her. He saw her pale face, the blue tinge of her lips. He took off his own heavy wool coat, the one he had taken from the livery, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She looked up at him, her eyes huge and dark in the firelight. He sat down across the small fire from her. His shoulder, the one that had taken the beam, was a dull throb, but it was the rope burn on his neck that ached. He rubbed it, his fingers tracing the raw, chafed line. Lillian watched him. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the deep lines of pain. She saw the ugly, red mark on his neck. She reached out, her hand trembling. She did not ask. She just moved, her fingers light, and gently, so gently, touched the rope burn. The moment her skin touched his, Taza went still. It was the same as in the schoolhouse, the same light, gentle touch, the same fire. But this was not the schoolhouse. They were not the teacher and the warrior. They were just a man and a woman, hunted and alone at the end of the world. All the control he had, all the walls he had built, the ice he had packed around his heart, it all cracked. He had buried his desire. But it was not dead. It was just waiting, and her touch was the sun. He looked at her. his eyes burning in the firelight. He did not move, but his breath caught. Lillian did not pull her hand away. She saw the look in his eyes, the same raw hunger she had seen in the schoolroom. But this time, it was not frightening. It was devastating. It was a mirror of the ache in her own chest. She slowly moved her hand from his neck to his chest, flat against his shirt. She could feel the heavy, frantic pounding of his heart. It matched her own.
"I was so afraid,"
she whispered, her voice a broken thing. "When they had the rope on you, I thought I had lost you." The admission, the you, was everything. Taza's face, which had been a mask of stone for 10 years, broke. A look of profound, aching pain crossed his features. He started, his voice rough. "I have not allowed this for any of it. My wife, my son, they are gone. My life is for the people, for the fight. There is no room for a home, for this." He gestured between them, at the small, fragile space they occupied. "There is only what is," Lillian whispered. She leaned forward, across the small fire. "There is only here and now." He met her halfway. He reached out, his hand sliding behind her neck, his fingers tangling in the hair that had come loose from its pins. He pulled her to him. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate. It was the taste of dust and fear and 10 years of buried grief. It was all the words they could not say. It was his strength and her defiance, his loneliness and her courage. It was a drowning man taking a first, agonizing breath. He kissed her again, slower this time, a long, deep exploration, as if he was memorizing her. The taste of her was life, and it terrified him, and he could not, would not, pull away. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing as if they had been running. He did not release her. He pulled her from her side of the fire, settling her next to him, wrapping the blanket, his coat, and his own arms around her. They did not speak for a long time. They just huddled together, sharing warmth, listening to the wind scream outside the cave. It was a world of chaos, but in this small, dark place, there was a tiny, fragile center of stillness. Later, in the dark, they lay side by side under the blanket. Not for passion, but for survival. The fire was just embers. The cold was a living thing. "My shoulder," he whispered, his voice quiet, his lips near her ear. "The beam. In the school. You were the first person to touch me, with kindness. Since she died." "My mother," she whispered back, her own voice thick, "taught me that there are two kinds of people, those who build walls and those who mend wounds. I did not know which one I was until I met you." They shared their old wounds in the dark, their whispered words a shield against the storm. They did not make love. They did not need to. In that cave, 2 worlds had touched. 2 exiles had found a home. Their belonging was a thing of spirit, of shared breath and absolute trust, more profound than any physical act. They fell asleep like that, 2 hunted animals, finding a moment of impossible peace. The sound that woke them was not the wind. It was a gunshot. It was distant, but it was unmistakable, echoing down the narrow canyon. Taza was on his feet in an instant, his knife in his hand. He smothered the last ember of the fire with sand. Lillian was right behind him, her heart frozen. They crept to the mouth of the cave. The storm had lessened, the dust settling. The light was a cold, gray dawn, and at the far end of the small, hidden canyon, at the narrow entrance, were 3 riders, Pike's men. They had found the trail. "They are trapped," one of the men yelled, his voice carrying on the wind. "They went in, but they did not come out. Go get the others. We have them." 2 of the riders turned and rode away. 1 remained, his rifle across his lap, guarding the only exit. Taza pulled Lillian back into the darkness. They were not safe. They were cornered. "They will be back," he said, his voice flat. "All of them." "What do we do?" she asked, her voice shaking. Taza looked around the cave. He looked at the steep, sheer walls of the canyon. "We cannot run," he said. He picked up his rifle, the one he had taken from the livery. He checked the load. "So, we fight." He moved back toward the mouth of the cave, into the deepest shadows. He was a duelist, but his chosen ground was the high rocks. He motioned for Lillian to stay deep in the cave. "If I fall," he said, his voice quiet, "go up. Through the back. There is a small crack. You can climb. They will not follow. Go to my people."
"Taza, no."
"Go," he commanded. He settled himself into the rocks, the rifle steady, his eyes on the narrow canyon entrance. He was a warrior again, but this time he was not fighting out of rage or for his own honor. He was fighting for the woman behind him. He heard the sound of approaching horses, many of them. He sighted down the barrel of the rifle, his breathing slow and even. He waited. The sound of the returning horses was a dull, growing thunder. Taza pressed himself into the shadow of a boulder, his rifle a cold, heavy line of steel. He was one man, his body aching, his shoulder a knot of fire. They were 7. The odds were not good, but the land was his. This was his ground. The gunmen rode into the narrow canyon slowly, their eyes scanning the rocks, their rifles ready. They were confident. They had them trapped. The man who had been left to guard the entrance pointed up toward the cave. "They are in there. I ain't seen nothing move." The leader, a man with a scarred face Taza recognized from the saloon, dismounted. "Climb up, 2 of you. Flush them out. We will wait here. Pike wants the man. Taza, the woman. She is just a bonus." 2 men began to scramble up the loose rock, moving toward the cave. Taza did not fire. He waited. He let them climb, let them get halfway up the scree slope. He shifted his gaze to a spot high above them, where a dead, dry pine tree had been wedged between 2 boulders for a century, holding back a ton of loose rock. He raised his rifle. He did not aim at the men. He aimed at the one small, rotting piece of wood that held the log in place. He fired. The sound of the shot was a sharp crack. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that sounded like the mountain clearing its throat, the dead pine shifted. The entire wall of rock above the gunmen dissolved. It was not a slide. It was an avalanche. The men on the slope looked up, their faces white. They had time to shout, a single, short sound, before the world fell on them. Rocks, dust, and boulders poured down the canyon wall. A gray, thundering river. It swept the 2 climbers away like leaves and slammed into the canyon floor, completely blocking the pass. Horses screamed. The men below, Taza's original target, scattered as boulders the size of wagons crashed around them. One man was not fast enough. A rock caught his horse, and the animal went down, its legs crushed, pinning the rider to the ground. The other 4 men, their faces masks of terror and dust, turned their horses and fled, galloping out of the canyon as if the devil himself was behind them. They were hired guns, not warriors. They would not fight a man who could command the mountain to fall. The silence that returned was absolute, broken only by the high, thin screaming of the injured horse and the groans of the trapped man. Taza stood up from his hiding place, his rifle held loosely at his side. Lillian emerged from the cave, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. They walked down to the canyon floor. The man was pinned under his dead horse, his leg twisted at an impossible angle. He was the one who had been leading them, the scarred man from the saloon. He looked up at Taza, his face pale with agony and fear.
God, oh God, help me,
he whimpered, his bravado gone. "Get this thing off me. My leg. It is broke." Taza looked at him, his face as hard and unforgiving as the rock that had fallen. He recognized the man. He had been at the jail. He had been one of the men holding the rope. This was one of the men who had burned Sani's hogan. Taza's hand moved to the knife at his belt.
Please,
the man begged, tears cutting paths through the dust on his face.
Please, I was just taking orders. I was just doing a job. That is all.
Lillian stepped forward, her hands clasped.
Whose orders?
She asked, her voice clear and sharp. The man looked from her to Taza's knife. He was a man with no options left.
Pike,
he gasped.
Edward Pike.
It was all him, every bit of it. Taza went still.
Tell us,
he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble.
The stage,
the man cried, his words tumbling out.
Pike paid us to hit the payroll stage. He said to leave a driver, make him think it was Indians. He said it would start a fire, get the army here. He wanted the valley.
Lillian looked at Taza, her eyes wide. It was exactly as she had suspected.
And the fire?
Taza's voice was barely a whisper.
The old woman.
The man's face crumpled.
That was an accident. I swear to God we was just supposed to scare you. Burn an empty hogan. Make it look like a cook fire. We did not know she was in there. We did not. But you did it, Taza said. You lit the match. And last night?
Lillian pressed, her voice cold.
The jail.
Yes,
the man sobbed.
Pike told us. He said the plan was getting messy. He said we had to rescue Taza, to kill him in the gunfight, make it look like the Navajo did it.
He looked directly at Lillian, his eyes full of a new terror.
And he said if you got in the way, teacher, you was to be in the way. He wanted you dead, too.
The confession hung in the dusty air, complete and ugly. Taza looked down at the man, and all the rage he had buried, all the pain from the rope, all the grief for Sani, coalesced into a single, cold point. This man was the proof, but he was also the weapon. He had admitted to murder. Taza raised his knife. The man's confession was a death sentence.
He killed Sani, Taza said, his voice flat. He came to murder me. He came to murder you. He has earned his death. Taza, no.
Lillian grabbed his arm, the one holding the knife.
Stop, wait.
Get out of the way, Lillian, he snarled. This is not your law. This is ours.
This is not about law,
she cried, her body trembling, but she did not let go.
This is about Pike. Do you not see you kill this man? And what is he?
He is another body in the desert. His words die with him. It is your word against Pike's, and they will never believe you. He is not a man anymore. Taza, he is our proof. His word is useless. His confession is everything you cannot kill him. That is Pike's way. That is revenge. She put her hand over his, her soft skin against his fist.
We need justice. Please, do not let them turn you into the man they say you are.
He stared at her, his whole body shaking with the effort of holding back. The conflict tore him apart. The warrior wanted the blood. The man who had held her in the cave. He heard her. He saw the new path, the third way he had spoken of. It was harder. It was 1,000 times harder than killing. Slowly, agonizingly, he lowered his hand. The knife flashed as he slid it back into its sheath.
We will need a rope,
he said, his voice hoarse. And your bandages. He cannot die before he speaks. They rode back to the Navajo village. A strange, grim procession. Taza and Lillian rode the 2 horses, and between them, the wounded gunman, Jed, was tied to his own saddle, his crushed leg bound tightly, his face gray with pain. When they entered the valley, the village stopped. People emerged from their hogans, their faces stunned. Taza was alive. The white woman was with him, and they had a white prisoner. Taza said nothing. He rode to the center of the camp, cut the prisoner free, and dumped him on the ground in front of the chief's fire.
Call the council,
Taza ordered.
This man has a story to tell.
That night, the council fire burned high. The entire village was there. Jed, terrified, his leg throbbing, sat in the dirt. He looked at the circle of hard, silent faces, and he knew his life depended on his words. He told them everything. He told them about Pike, the stagecoach, the payroll, the plan to blame the Navajo. He told them about the fire, about the coal oil, about the accident of Sonny's death. He told them about the plan to kill Taza in the jail and burn it down. When he finished, a deep, terrible sound rose from the crowd. It was a sound of profound grief and bottomless rage. Kohani stepped into the firelight, his face a mask of cold fury. He was no longer a hot-headed boy. The past few days had burned that out of him. He looked at Taza, and then at the prisoner.
"He admits it," Kohani said, his voice ringing. "He admits to burning Sonny. The law of the dying is clear. He is a murderer, caught. His life is forfeit. Give him to us, Uncle," he said to the chief. "Give him to me. We will show them our justice."
Several of the older warriors grunted in agreement.
"Blood for blood,"
one of them said.
"It is the only way."
But the chief held up his hand. "And if we kill him?"
"What then, Kohani?"
"We prove Pike right. We prove we are the savages he says we are. They will send the army, not a detachment, an army. They will hunt us from the canyons, and it will be the long walk all over again. Is that the justice you want, to sacrifice the people for the blood of one worthless man?" The council was split. The desire for revenge was a physical, palpable thing, but the fear of annihilation was just as strong. Into this silence, Taza stepped forward. He stood over the prisoner, but he looked at his people. "I have failed you," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the night air. Every person strained to hear. "I tried to walk two paths. I tried to use the white man's law to protect us, and I tried to hold back our own warriors. I thought I was being clever. I was only being a coward." He paused, the admission hanging in the air. "I was a man walking a line in the dust, and I belonged nowhere. I was afraid of war, but I was also afraid of peace. I was afraid to live. I buried my heart in the ground with my wife and my son. I told myself a warrior had no room for softness, for a life." He turned and looked directly at Lillian. She was standing at the back of the crowd, next to Atsa, an outsider. Taza held her gaze. "This woman," he said, his voice clear, "stood before a mob for me. She faced their guns for me. She showed me there is a third way, not to run and not to fight a war we cannot win, but to stand, to speak the truth, even if it kills you." He looked back at the council. "She is a white woman, but her heart is true. She is dying, in her spirit. I will not hide this. I have chosen her, and she has chosen me." A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. This was more stunning than the prisoner's confession. A Navajo warrior, a man of his standing, choosing a white woman and admitting it before the entire tribe. Atsa, hearing his words, ran from the crowd and grabbed Lillian's hand, holding it tight. Kohani stared at his cousin, his mouth open. He looked at Lillian, at the small girl holding her hand, and his face, which had been so hard, softened with a dawning, complex understanding. While the Navajo debated, the town of Red Mesa was doing the same. Deputy Hayes had not ridden to the fort. He had ridden into the hills, hidden, and watched. He had seen the smoke from the jail, and his cowardice had turned to a cold, hard anger. He was a weak man, but he was not part of a murder plot. He had ridden back into town at dawn, his story ready. "He found the blacksmith, Mr. Gable, shoeing a horse." "It was Pike," Hayes said, his voice low. "He did it. He burned the jail, Taza and the teacher. They are gone, dead, most likely." Gable stopped hammering. "I knew it," he said, his voice a low growl. "I knew it did not sit right. That man Taza, he stood outside that school for a week, just watching his sister. He was not a killer. And Pike—" "My wife told me," Mrs. Gable said, stepping out of the store, her face pale.
Pike offered Lillian a new schoolhouse, if she would spy on the children. On Atsa. Lillian told him no, and now this. He is a monster.
The word spread. The town, which had been a mob, was now a gathering of duped, angry citizens. They were furious, not at the Navajo, but at the man who had lied to them, who had used them, who had made them complicit in murder. Back in the village, Taza laid out his plan. "We will not kill the prisoner," he said. "We will not hide him. We will not wait for the army, which will only believe Collins's lies. We will do what they do not expect." "What?" the chief asked. "We will take the proof to the town. We will stand in their street. We will bring the prisoner, and the shell casing, and the truth. We will stand before them, all of us, and we will let them see what kind of man rules them. We will let them choose. This is the third way. This is Lillian's way." It was the most dangerous gamble of his life. The next morning, they walked. It was not a war party. It was a procession. Taza walked in front, his rifle in his hand. Lillian walked beside him, her head high. Behind them came the chief, and Kohani, and Atsa, and behind them, nearly 60 men and women of the Navajo tribe, walking in silence. They were not painted. They carried no weapons. They were a nation, coming to ask for justice. In the middle of them, they led the horse carrying the bound and terrified Jed. They entered the main street of Red Mesa. The town went dead silent. "Mister." Gable dropped his hammer. "Mrs." Gable came to the door of the store. Every citizen, white, Mexican, came out onto the boardwalks, their faces a mix of fear and confusion. Pike and Collins burst out of the saloon, followed by the 4 gunmen who had survived the canyon. Pike's hand was bandaged, and his face was a mask of pure, reptilian hate. "What is this?" Pike roared, his voice hoarse. "An invasion, I told you, Hayes. Get your gun, arrest them." "No," Deputy Hayes said. He stepped off the boardwalk, his own pistol in his hand. He was not looking at Taza. He was looking at Pike. "Taza!" Pike bellowed. Ignoring the deputy, "You are a dead man. You will hang for this." "We have brought a man who wishes to speak." "Pike," Taza called out, his voice clear and calm, echoing in the street. "He has a story to tell. About you." He pulled Jed off the horse. The man stumbled, his broken leg collapsing under him. "He is lying!" Collins shrieked, his voice cracking. "It is a trick. They have tortured him. It is an Indian lie." "Tell them," Taza commanded, his voice like thunder. Jed, on his knees, looked at Pike's gunmen, and then at the circle of angry, betrayed faces of the townsfolk. He saw no escape. He paid us," Jed choked out. "Pike, he paid us for everything. The stage, the fire. He told us to kill Taza and the teacher. He told us to burn the jail. It was all him. He lied to you. He lied to all of you." The crowd let out a single, collective gasp. Pike's face went white. He was exposed. He was ruined. "Fire!" he screamed at his men, his voice a desperate shriek. "Kill them! Kill them all!" The 4 gunmen raised their rifles, aiming at the unarmed Navajo. "No, mister!" Gable roared. He stepped into the street, his heavy buffalo rifle in his hands. He was joined by 2 other men from the boardwalk, the store owner and the blacksmith's apprentice. They stood between Pike's men and the Navajo. "This is our town. Pike misses." Gable screamed from the doorway. "Not yours." It was a standoff, Pike's hired guns against the armed citizens of Red Mesa. In that moment of perfect, stretched silence, Pike saw his entire world collapsing. His eyes, full of mad rage, darted around. He saw Taza standing 10 yards away, his rifle held at his side. He saw the townsfolk, and then he saw the person who had caused it all. He ripped his own pistol from his holster. He did not aim at Taza. He aimed at Lillian. Taza saw it. He had been waiting. This was the moment. The warrior in him. The man who had lost his family. The man who had been lynched. The man who had seen Sanny's body. That man screamed at him to fire, to put a bullet in Pike's black heart. End it. Avenge them all. He saw Lillian's face, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a strange, fierce trust in him. He heard her voice in his memory. We need justice, not revenge. Time slowed. He made the choice. The third way. He fired. The shot was not aimed at Pike's chest. It was aimed at his hand. The bullet struck the heavy steel of Pike's revolver, shattering the gun, ripping it from his grip in an explosion of metal and wood. Pike howled, a high, thin sound, and collapsed, clutching his mangled, bleeding hand. The standoff was broken. Taza stepped forward, into the center of the street, and placed his rifle on the ground. He stood, his hands open and empty. The 4 gunmen, seeing their leader screaming in the dust, seeing the townsfolk with their rifles steady, lost their nerve. They slowly, one by one, lowered their weapons. It is over, Hayes said, his voice shaking. He walked forward and kicked Pike's shattered pistol away. He nodded to Mr. Gable, who walked over and jabbed his rifle into Agent Collins's soft stomach. You are done, Agent, Gable growled. Collins whimpered and raised his hands high in the air. Hayes walked over to Pike, who was rocking on the ground, sobbing with rage and pain. Edward Pike, the deputy said, his voice gaining a strength he never knew he had. You are under arrest for murder, for robbery, for conspiracy, and for being a damned fool. The truth, raw and ugly, lay exposed in the middle of the street. The war was over, but the wounds, for everyone, were still wide open. The silence that fell on the main street of Red Mesa was louder than the gunshot had been. It was a heavy, stunned silence, thick with shame and the smoke from the ruined jail. The 2 groups, the townsfolk on the boardwalks and the Navajo standing in the dust, stared at each other. The liars were defeated, their weapons on the ground. But the deep, raw canyon of mistrust between the 2 peoples remained. Edward Pike was on the ground, howling, clutching his ruined hand. Agent Collins stood near the water trough, his face the color of old dough, held at bay by Thomas Gable's rifle. The 4 hired gunmen, now leaderless, stood with their hands raised. Deputy Hayes was the first to move. He had spent his whole life being a weak man, but in firing that single shot, Taza had not just disarmed Pike, he had given Hayes a spine. The deputy holstered his pistol, his movements no longer shaking. Gable, Hayes said, his voice hard. Take Mr. Collins to the cell. The one he did not burn. Lock him up. You, he said to the blacksmith's apprentice. Tie these other 4 up. They are material witnesses. He walked over to Pike, who was trying to curse through his sobs of pain. Dr. Miller, Hayes yelled. See to this man, then see he is locked in his own office. Post a guard. He is under federal arrest. Taza watched, his rifle still warm in his hands. He had not lowered it. He looked at Lillian, then at his people. The chief stepped forward. The prisoner, Jed, the chief said to Hayes. He is yours. He is your proof. The transfer of the wounded, terrified gunman was the first act of the new piece. The news of what had happened, the real story, spread faster than a prairie fire. It went out on the telegraph wires, carried by stage drivers, and whispered in every ranch and settlement within 100 miles. The story of Pike's conspiracy, the fake robbery, the murder of the old woman, and the teacher who had stopped a lynching became a legend in a matter of days. The men who had ridden with Pike, who had followed his orders and drank his whiskey, suddenly felt the chill of the noose on their own necks. Some, like the bartender at the Red Dog Saloon, were gone by morning. Their businesses locked, their horses ridden hard. Others, who had been part of the mob, were overwhelmed with a deep, sickly shame. Sarah Gable, the blacksmith's wife,
was the first to cross the divide. She walked out into the street, past the ashes of the jail, to where Lillian was standing with Atsa. Mrs. Gable's hands were twisting in her apron. "Miss Hart," she said, her voice low. We were wrong. We let that man fill us with hate. What you did, standing on that wagon. It was the bravest thing I ever saw." She looked at Atsa. "And you, child, your brother. He is a good man." She turned and hurried away, her shoulders shaking. The legal justice was swift. The territorial government, horrified at the corruption in its own agency and the near outbreak of a full-scale war, sent a federal marshal. He was a hard, quiet man who did not drink and did not trust anyone. He listened to Deputy Hayes. He listened to the gunman Jed. He listened to Lillian. And he listened, in a meeting that lasted 4 hours, to Taza, with the chief at his side. Agent Collins was taken away in chains, his career over, his future a small, dark cell. Edward Pike, his hand crudely amputated by Dr. Miller, lost everything. His wealth, built on paper lies, dissolved under the federal investigation. The land he had stolen, including the contracts for the railroad, was seized. The government, in a rare act of conscience, and under enormous pressure from the new reports, formally ceded the Sacred Valley back to the Navajo. The paper justice, at last, was done. But the town of Red Mesa had to find its own justice. The mayor, his authority shattered, called a town meeting. This time, it was not a gathering of one people. It was a meeting of two. He sent a formal, written invitation to the chief. They met in the church. It was the only building large enough to hold everyone. The townsfolk, in their Sunday best, sat on the pica benches on one side. The Navajo, in their colorful blankets, sat on the other. A wide, empty aisle ran between them, a symbol of the space that still separated them. At the front sat the mayor, Deputy Hayes, the chief, Taza, and Lillian. The mayor, his hands shaking, stood and spoke. He spoke of shame and of being deceived. He offered the town's formal apology for the mob, for the fire, for the death of Sonny. Then the chief stood. Taza rose beside him to translate. The old man's voice was not angry. It was filled with a sorrow that was as old as the mountains. He spoke of the land. He spoke of the sacred water. He spoke of the children. "We do not wish to be your enemy," Taza translated, his own voice quiet. "We only wish to live. The land does not belong to us. We belong to the land. We ask only that you respect our mother." They needed a new agreement. Thomas Gable, the blacksmith, stood up. "We have been bad neighbors," he said, his voice rumbling through the church. "We let Pike's lies poison us. I say we draw a new line, not with rifles, but with handshakes." For 3 hours, they talked. They hammered out a new treaty, a local one. The high valleys and the sacred springs were Navajo land. Forever. The lower grazing plains, the ones Pike had coveted, would be shared, with herds from both sides allowed during the dry season. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a start. Near the end, Sarah Gable stood. "And what about the school?" she asked. "The old one is burned. And what about Miss Hart?" The mayor cleared his throat. "The town council has approved the funds. We will build you the new school, Miss Hart, the brick one you were promised, the finest school in the territory." A murmur of approval went through the pews on the white side of the church. Lillian stood. She was tired. Her dress was still stained, but her voice was clear. She looked at the two groups, separated by the aisle. "A new school in town," she said, "will be a white school. A school in the valley would be a Navajo school. That is not what we need. We do not need another wall." She looked at Taza, then at the chief. "Build the school on the boundary line," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Build it in the middle. Build it where the children of the town and the children of the valley can walk to it in the same amount of time. Build it with 2 doors. We will learn English. Yes,
We will learn arithmetic, and we will learn the Navajo language. We will learn how to read books, and we will learn how to read the stories in the stars. It will not be my school, or your school. It will be our school." The silence that followed this was profound. It was a radical idea, but it was the only one that made sense. Into that silence, another man stood, Kohani. He had sat in the back, his face a mask of shame, watching his cousin. He stepped into the aisle, his hands empty. He looked at the chief, and then at Taza. He spoke in Navajo, his voice thick but steady. Taza translated, and as he did, the hardness left his own face, replaced by a deep, pained understanding. "My cousin, Kohani, wishes to speak. He says he was a fool. He says his anger was a fire that burned his own people. He looked at me, and he saw a man who was weak. He did not see a man who was walking a path of thorns." Kohani turned and looked at Taza. "He asks my forgiveness for not trusting him, and he asks the forgiveness of this town for the cattle he killed and the boy he wounded." The chief stood. "You have the fire of a warrior, Kohani," he said, and Taza's voice was proud as he translated. "You were just aiming it at the wrong enemy. The anger is gone, but the boundary remains. From now on, you will guard it. You will lead the patrol, a patrol of our young men, and any young men from the town who wish to ride with you. You will protect the new peace." Kohani stood straight, his shame replaced by a new, hard-won purpose. He had been redeemed. When the meeting ended, the spell was broken. People talked, but it was in low, hesitant murmurs. Taza and Lillian walked out of the church together, into the bright, clear sunlight. And the talking stopped. The townsfolk, who had just praised them both, stared. The white women looked at Lillian, their faces a mixture of awe and pity. They saw her, a good, brave woman, standing next to him, a savage, a man who, though a hero, was still not one of them. The Navajo elders watched as well. They nodded to Taza, their respect for him restored, but their eyes slid past Lillian. She was the one who had saved him, but she was also the white woman who had claimed him. They walked down the main street, hand in hand. It was the first time they had done so in the light of day. They were a public fact, and the stares were a new kind of weapon, quieter than a gun, but just as sharp. An old Navajo woman, a relative of Sani, the woman who had burned, stood by the general store. She watched them approach. She looked at Taza, and her face was full of sorrow. She looked at Lillian, and her face was blank, a stone wall. She said nothing. She just pulled her blanket tighter and turned her back on them both. Lillian flinched, but she did not let go of his hand. They walked past the town, past the edge of the valley, until they reached the sacred spring. The water bubbled from the red rock, cool and clean. It was the place the fighting had started, and it was the only place that felt truly peaceful. They knelt by the water, and Lillian dipped her hands, washing the dust and the memory of the jail from her skin. Taza did the same. He watched her, his face quiet, his eyes full of a deep, aching sadness. He saw the stairs. He had felt the old woman turn her back. "You are safe now, Lillian," he said, his voice low. She looked up at him, water dripping from her hands. "Yes, we are." "The stagecoach runs east on Tuesday," he said, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the rippling water. "Deputy Hayes will put a guard on it for you, a full patrol, all the way to Santa Fe. You can go home, back to your green lawns, back to your own people." Lillian's breath caught. She stood up, her skirt heavy with water. "Go, you are sending me away." He stood and faced her, and his eyes were full of a pain that was deeper than any physical wound. "I am setting you free," he said. "You have done your work. You have saved us. You gave us the truth. But this," he gestured to the town behind them, "and the village in front of them, this is not your place.
You saw the faces. To them. He nodded at the town. You will always be the Indian lover, a woman who betrayed her own, and to us. He nodded at the valley. You will always be white, the outsider. You will live in the middle, in the dust between our worlds. Like I did. It is a lonely place. Lillian, I will not be the man who traps you there. It was the greatest sacrifice he could make. He had found her, only to let her go for her own good. She stared at him, her heart breaking, not for his words, but for the loneliness he had endured, the loneliness he was willing to accept again. For her. She stepped toward him and put her hands on his chest. She felt his heart, steady and strong. You are wrong, she whispered. It is not a lonely place. Not if you are there with me. It is the only place. I am not a person who mends. I am not a person who builds walls. I am just a person who loves you. She rose on her toes and kissed him. A soft, gentle kiss that was not born of fear or desperation, but of pure, simple choice. I am not from the East anymore, she said, her forehead resting against his. My home is not there. My home is a dusty, broken warehouse. It is a smoky cave in a storm. My home, Taza. It is wherever you are. I am not leaving. I am not ever leaving. He closed his eyes, a single, hot tear escaping and tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her so tight he could feel her heartbeat. He buried his face in her hair. He was not burying his desire. He was home. When they walked back to the village, they were hand in hand. Their choice was made. The chief was waiting for them outside his hogan. He was not alone. With him were two of the clan mothers, old women with faces like carved wood. They were the true power in the village. Taza saw them and tensed, stepping slightly in front of Lillian, ready to defend their decision. The chief held up one hand, silencing him. He did not look at Taza. He looked at Lillian. One of the old women, the sister of Sani, the one whose back had been a wall of stone, stepped forward. She looked at Lillian, her black eyes searching, probing, seeing everything. She spoke, a series of short, quiet questions in the Navajo language. Lillian looked at Taza, confused. Taza stared at the old woman, his own face filled with a sudden, dawning wonder. She asks, he said, his voice rough with emotion. She asks if your hands are tired. She asks if you have finished teaching, and if you are ready to learn. Learn, Lillian whispered. Learn what? How to grind the corn, the chief said, speaking in his own heavy English. How to find the root that stops the fever. How to listen to the mountain when it speaks. How to weave the stories of the people, so you can teach them to your own children. The old woman stepped forward and held out her hand. It was a test. It was an invitation. Lillian looked at Taza. He was smiling, a real, true smile that lit his eyes. Lillian turned back to the old woman. She took a deep breath, and she put her hand in hers. The wedding was not one ceremony, but two, held on the boundary line, in the wide, open space between the recovering town and the mouth of the valley. The ashes of the old jail had been cleared, and the foundation of the new school was a line of fresh stones in the dirt. First, in the morning, the town came, a traveling Methodist preacher, a thin, nervous man with a large, black book, stood on a crate. Lillian wore her only good dress, a simple, dark blue cotton that she had meticulously mended. Thomas Gable stood as her witness, his large, calloused hand resting awkwardly on his new suit coat. Sarah Gable, her eyes wet, held a small posy of desert wildflowers. Deputy Hayes stood near the back, his hat in his hand, a symbol of the new, fragile law. The preacher spoke of the union of man and woman, of duty and faith. Taza stood beside Lillian, his scarred hand holding hers. He wore clean, simple buckskins. He did not understand all the words, but he understood the gravity. He saw the faces of the white townsfolk curiosity, a hesitant acceptance, and in some, a lingering shadow of disbelief. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife according to the laws of the territory, the silence was broken by Thomas Gable clapping his huge hands together, a sound like an axe splitting wood. The town, startled, followed his lead. Then, in the afternoon, the people came. The preacher and the townsfolk did not leave. They stayed, moving to the edge of the circle, watching. The chief stood where the preacher had stood. The air grew still. The clan mothers, the old women who had tested Lillian, approached. They carried not flowers, but a blanket. It was a new blanket, woven in secret over the last few weeks. The pattern was one of white and red, the colors of the cliffs and the springs, and in the center was the shape of the Spider-Woman's cross, the symbol of weaving and creation. The old woman who was Sani's sister, the one who had turned her back, was the one who held it. She and the other women wrapped it around Lillian's shoulders, over her blue dress. It was heavy and warm, and it smelled of juniper smoke and wool. It was an embrace. Then the chanting began, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The medicine man, the Hatali, drew a circle of golden corn pollen on the ground. He had Taza and Lillian step into it. They faced east. Taza spoke, and his voice was not the low, clipped command of the warrior. It was the full, open voice of a man making a vow. He spoke in Navajo, but every person there, white and Navajo, understood his meaning. I stand before my people, and before the spirits of this land, he said, his eyes on Lillian. I stand before the woman who found my heart when I had buried it. For 10 winters, my life was a stone. My desire was a seed in the frozen ground. She came with gentle hands, and she brought the sun. I will no longer be a man of 2 worlds. I will be a man of 1. My home is Lillian. My home is Atsa. My home is the children who will learn in the new school. My strength, which I once saved for war, I now give to this peace. I will protect this family. I will protect this land. Then Lillian spoke. She had practiced the words, but her voice trembled. She did not just speak in English. She began with the Navajo words of greeting the clan mothers had taught her, clumsy and soft, but clear. The women in the circle nodded, a low murmur of approval. I came here, she said, her hand finding Taza's, with books. I thought I had come to teach, but I was the one who was empty. I knew nothing of the land, of the spirit, of the heart. My hands, they knew how to hold a pen. Now they know how to hold a life. She looked at the faces in the crowd, at Mrs. Gable and at the chief. I will use these hands. I will help build the school. I will fill it with the white man's history, and with the stories of the dying. We will not erase the past, either of ours. We will place them side by side. We will teach our children that a page of a book and a line of pollen can both be sacred. I choose this land. I choose this people. I choose this man. Forever. The medicine man sprinkled pollen on their heads, a blessing of fertility and peace. The ceremony was over. The 2 worlds had met in the middle. The seasons turned. The harsh winter gave way to a spring of surprising, gentle rain. The new schoolhouse rose on the boundary line. It was built of thick, solid pine, cut and milled by Thomas Gable and his son, and it was built with adobe bricks, made in the valley by the Navajo men and women, who mixed the mud with straw and sang as they worked. It had 2 doors, one facing the town, one facing the valley. Inside, the light was clear and bright. On a warm afternoon in the following autumn, the room was full. It buzzed with the sound of children. Lillian stood at the slate blackboard. Atsa stood beside her, no longer a shy child, but a bright, confident young woman. She was Lillian's assistant. Today, Lillian said, we will learn the words for family. This, she wrote the word mother, is how we write it in English. Atsa. Atsa stepped forward, her dark eyes shining. She pointed to a Navajo woman in a drawing on the wall. "Ama," she said, her voice clear. "Ama," the children repeated. The chorus was a mix of voices. In the back row, a tall, lanky boy of 14 bent over his slate, his brow furrowed in concentration. He carefully copied the letters. It was Sam Gable. He was not just a student. He was the oldest, and he was the one who helped the younger Navajo children with their English letters, his voice quiet and patient. The truce held. It was not a perfect peace. It was a human peace, which meant it was messy, and it had to be rebuilt every day. That night, in the small, solid cabin that Taza and Thomas Gable had built near the sacred springs, Lillian stood by the open window. She was not wearing her Eastern dress. She wore a simple Navajo skirt and a soft cotton blouse. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders. Taza came up behind her. He did not speak. He just put his arms around her, his hands coming to rest on her stomach. She was full with their first child, the curve of her belly pressing against his own. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, which had long since healed. The scar, a pale white line on his dark skin. "The nights are getting cold," she whispered, her hand covering his. "Yes," he said. "The winter will be hard. The army has sent a new man to the fort. He has cold eyes." She sighed. "And the railroad surveyors were back. At the north end of the county." She felt him nod, his chin moving against her hair. The world had not stopped. Pike and Collins were gone, but the hunger they represented was not. There would be new men, new greed, new challenges. There would be drought and sickness and arguments over grazing land. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "No," Taza said, his voice a low, soft rumble against her back. "I am not afraid. They will come. We will face them, but we are not alone. You are here. The people are strong. The town is learning. We have roots now. You have given me roots. Lillian." He kissed her shoulder, his lips warm on her skin. It was an act of simple, profound intimacy, a quiet claiming that was more powerful than any desperate kiss in a cave. They were not two exiles anymore. They were the center of a new world. The next day, in the schoolyard, Atsa was drawing in a patch of smooth, cleared sand. She was using colored pollen and sand, the way the medicine man had taught her. It was a picture. In the center, a tall warrior with a rifle stood hand in hand with a woman with yellow hair and a blue dress. They were standing between two great red mountains, one for the town, one for the valley, and high above them, its wings spread wide against the blue sky, flew a single, great eagle. It was a sign of protection. It was a sign of freedom. Taza watched his sister for a moment, his heart full. He understood what he had won. It was not a war. It was a future. He knew, looking at that drawing, that love did not erase the differences between people. It did not make the Navajo white, or the white man Navajo. It just made a space where both could stand, side by side, and be whole. He knew that justice was not a gift from the government. It was a thing you had to build yourself, out of courage and truth, and a few brave people, like a teacher and a blacksmith, who were willing to stand up. And he knew that forgiveness was not about forgetting. It was about choosing not to let the past, the fire, the rope, and the blood define the future. He mounted his horse. Lillian was already waiting, sitting on her own mare. She had learned to ride like one of the people, not with a saddle, but with a blanket, her balance easy and sure. They rode up the slow, winding path to the canyon rim, the place where he used to watch the world in his bitter loneliness. They stopped at the edge. Looking down, the sun was setting, bleeding that same liquid fire over the red cliffs. But the view was different. Below them, they did not just see a town and a village. They saw a community. They saw the small, solid shape of the new school. The two doors open. a bridge of stone and wood. They saw the smoke rising from the hogans, and the smoke rising from the chimneys of Red Mesa. Taza looked out at the vast, endless sky, at the red rocks that held the spirits of his ancestors. He spoke, his voice low, in the ancient soft words of the Dane. He was thanking them. He was thanking them for their strength, for their endurance, and for finally sending the pale woman with the gentle hands, the woman who had seen the warrior he was, and had saved the man he was meant to be. Lillian leaned her head against his shoulder. She did not understand all the words, but she understood his heart. She whispered back, in her own clumsy, loving Navajo, "I hear you, my husband, I am here." They sat on their horses, side by side, two small figures on the rim of the world, watching the last light paint the valley of their new, hard-won, and beautiful home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I am so curious. Where in the world are you listening from? Please let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts on Taza and Lilian's journey. Please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you really enjoyed it, please press that hype button. It helps more than you know, and it allows this story to be heard by so many more people.